Chapter 13:16 An unknown city. If I keep accumulating it bit by bit, it won't be long before I can respond to Moon City's prayers and cure their deformity, thus creating quite a miracle. In addition, I've also concluded the acting principles of a miracle invoker. It's only a matter of time before I digest it if I follow them. I might even finish within the year. Klein retracted his gaze from outside the window, raised his left arm, and controlled the monster puppet on his hand to entertain a child across him. This made him look more like a wandering magician. If he was willing, he could even use life's cane or the grafting ability to imbue this sock puppet with living characteristics. While entertaining the child, Klein's thoughts scattered as he considered where the marionette city needed to be built for the advancement ritual. A marionette city needs sufficient interaction to develop a corresponding region in the spirit world. This means that it isn't enough to leave it in the forsaken land of the gods. Ignoring the fact that it's sealed there, there's no way of directly connecting it to the spirit world. All I can do is rely on the little specialness it has. Even if there's no problem with it, it's difficult to create any interactivity with a place that lacks intelligent life. If it's placed in the northern and southern continent or the sea colonies, I have to be careful. Before the ritual is about to succeed, I definitely can't expose the fact that it's a marionette city. Otherwise, it will be affected, damaged, or even attacked by Zeradal, Amon, and my other enemies. Yes, I have to give a sufficiently good reason for a marionette city to appear. Then, there won't be any abnormalities with the interaction between the traveling merchants and the surrounding humans. I have to make every marionette a living person. They have their past, present, and future. They follow their own trajectories of fate. This means that a marionette city is extremely complicated. I need to split out many worms of spirit to deal with it. This also has the risk of losing control by doing so. If they are husband and wife, they should act like husband and wife. When faced with something they are fond of, they should show joy. Perverts should be hated. This way, foreigners might hear embarrassing sounds while staying in the marionette city. I'm still just an innocent child. This is a large-scale reality show, or rather, a high-end version of Playing House. It has to be able to deceive the audience. As Klein lampooned inwardly, he silently counted if he had enough marionettes. Previously, he had gone to the forsaken land of the gods several times and converted a large number of them. There were all kinds of monsters that might not have Beyonder characteristics. He also consciously controlled batches of rats, cockroaches, mosquitoes, and flies, hoping to make a more uncommon side of the city real enough. I'm barely able to support a small city, so just a few more visits to the forsaken land of the gods would do. Just as this thought flashed through Klein's mind, a scene suddenly appeared in front of him. At the top of the giant king's court, which was bathed in the light of dusk, the open door slowly and heavily closed. This was like a pair of invisible hands closing the entrance to the forsaken land of the gods. Klein's eyes darkened as he vaguely guessed that this scene meant that the true creator was about to seal off the forsaken land of the gods again. This was the prophetic power that came from his angel-level spiritual intuition and premonition for danger. It was about to happen a few minutes or a few seconds later. Did the true creator capture Amon? Or has he already given up? He once again sealed off the forsaken land of the gods. Does he not want others to enter again? Isn't this too petty? Klein mumbled inwardly, feeling a little disappointed. Of course, he barely had enough marionettes. Even if he lacked them, he could make up for it at sea. Backlund, Empress Burrow. Audrey had just changed her clothes and sent away her maidservants. Just as she was about to leave, she saw Susie walk in. What's the matter? You should be out on your stroll at this time. As an experienced spectator, Audrey immediately sensed that something was amiss. During this period of time, she had been busy making use of the influence she had in a few foundations to help the workers, farmers, and injured veterans with their hardships. She had allowed them to wait for a new job opportunity or for their plantation's production in a new season. She had a lot less interaction with Susie than usual. At the same time, Audrey was secretly guiding the workers of lower socioeconomic status from the various unions in Backland to gather their strength together. Her previous experiences made her understand that counting on the kindness of the upper class wasn't reliable or long-lasting. A single person appeared puny and powerless in the face of the government, nobles, and powerful merchants. Only by summoning the combined strength of a large number of civilians could a balance be formed. The Lone Kingdom had unions in different industries a long time ago, but the upper echelons of these associations were easily bribed. Instead, they became effective weapons against ordinary workers. Susie glanced at Audrey with a rather normal expression, but her mouth seemed to be out of control. It vibrated the air and let out a deep male voice. "Miss Audrey, I'm the president of the Psychology Alchemists, Eric Drake. I wish to meet you and discuss with you about becoming a counselor of the Psychology Alchemists. I'm at the nearby park." Having said that, Susie heaved a long sigh of relief and regained her original voice. "Audrey, there's a strange guy looking for you. I can't remember what he looks like. He directly placed the words he wanted to say into my mind island." Audrey's pupils dilated slightly before immediately returning to normal. She calmly nodded and said, "Where is he at the park?" As she spoke, Audrey secretly conjured a virtual persona and entered Susie's mind island through the sea of collective subconscious. She checked if it was still distorted by some external consciousness or knowledge. "I don't remember. I was having my stroll," Susie said as she recalled. Then, she wagged her tail slightly and said, "I don't think you should go. It's dangerous." After confirming that Susie didn't have any latent problems with her virtual persona, Audrey exhaled and said, "It will be even more suspicious if I don't go. That way, danger will be unavoidable. It might even affect the rest of the people in the house. Besides, this is also an opportunity. Just as Mr. Hanged Man said, since the end of the world is coming, all the hard work and attempts that will not bring disaster are meaningful." Audrey added inwardly before saying, "I will protect myself." "Susie, did anything happen to you just now?" Susie barked and said, "No, Audrey, are you really going?" "Yes." Audrey gave a clear answer. "Then can you bring me along?" Just like before, "I'm just a dog in their eyes," Susie mustered up her courage and said. "No, there's no need. I'll be back very soon. Believe me, I'll be blessed by a deity," Audrey replied with a faint smile. After comforting Susie, she used her psychological invisibility and left the luxurious villa like she usually did. When she was far away, in a corner on the first floor, a servant who was cleaning suddenly bowed his head and softly said words that he had never learned before, "The fool that doesn't belong to this era." In the ancient palace above the fog. The figure sitting in the fool's seat naturally looked at the newly formed prayer light and realized that the believer was extremely unfamiliar. It's identical to Miss Justice's home environment. I can suspect that it's a result of guidance created by a virtual persona's invasion of the mind island. Miss Justice used this method to avoid any surveillance and pray for blessings. The figure quickly came to a conclusion and transferred the corresponding situation to his true body. A few seconds later, Klein entered Sapphira Castle and allowed the worms of spirit to burrow into his body. Miss Justice is becoming more and more like a high-sequence spectator. Klein praised inwardly as he cast his gaze at the crimson star representing justice. In the park with a lake. As soon as Audrey entered, she saw a large carriage drive over. The carriage driver was an ordinary middle-aged man wearing an old hat and a dark-colored jacket. However, in Audrey's eyes, this carriage driver didn't exist because he didn't have a corresponding island of consciousness or mind. In other words, the carriage driver was just an illusion, a fake, and the controller of the carriage was the horse itself. A few seconds later, the large carriage stopped in front of Audrey. The door creaked open. "Please come in." A deep male voice came from inside. Audrey lifted the ends of her skirt slightly and boarded the carriage. She saw a man sitting on a black wheelchair. His pale yellow eyebrows were long and his hair was neatly combed back. There were some wrinkles on his forehead, and his face was abnormally pale. "Mr. Derlau? Aren't you already dead?" Audrey recognized the man in front of her and expressed her surprise perfectly. To a spectator, death only represents the end of one's identity. In other theatrical plays, "I'm still alive," the elderly gentleman who was sitting in a black wheelchair replied with a smile. Apart from the former royal family's medical consultant, the former chancellor of Backlund Medical School, I'm also king of the Black Throne Barrows Hopkins at sea. I'm the famous hermit, Eric Drake, etc. Then how should I address you? Audrey asked politely as she watched the door close automatically from the corner of her eye. The old gentleman stroked the wheels on both sides of his wheelchair and said, "You can call me Mr. President, or you can continue calling me Mr. Derlau." He then pointed to the seat on the left side of the carriage. "Have a seat. Let's head somewhere first before discussing you becoming a counselor of the psychology alchemists." Audrey nodded slightly and calmly sat down. Without hiding anything, she cast her gaze out of the window and was surprised to find that in the blink of an eye, the park had turned into an unfamiliar city, one that was shrouded in darkness. The city was filled with extremely mysterious and beautiful buildings that gave off a dark feeling. There were gentlemen wearing top hats and trench coats, as well as women in complicated and dark dresses. As Audrey swept her gaze, she saw a gentleman with short black hair beside a carriage, revealing sharp canine fangs in his mouth. This was a werewolf. Chapter 13-17 Pride. What is this place? Audrey asked without much change in her expression, as though she was asking about the location of the ball tonight. Paulie Derlau, who claimed to be the president of the psychology alchemists, cast his gaze out the window as well. He smiled and said, "This is the city in everyone's heart. It's present wherever there are people." Audrey nodded in thought. "In other words, you can enter this place from any corner of human society?" Derlau stroked his wheelchair and said, "That's right." He didn't explain further and instead pointed at the pedestrians outside the carriage. "Everything here has a corresponding psychological symbol. They are called bestial desire." Bestial desire. Audrey repeated the word silently. As she maintained her dignified posture, she cast her gaze even further. Among the pedestrians, there were werewolves, as well as walking upright bears. There were cats with lazy expressions, and there was a strange man with a face of a spotted spider, a huge mouse with red eyes, a python with its tongue sticking out, and a canine creature that studied every creature that passed it by with eyes filled with the desire to mate. They were either wearing a top hat and trench coat or an exquisite and complicated long dark dress, doing their best to imitate humans in every detail, but they were unable to truly resemble a human. The carriage traveled through the darkness of the night, traveling between pedestrians and all kinds of Gothic buildings. Soon, they arrived at a cathedral in the middle of the city. The cathedral was more than 80 meters tall, propped up thanks to the numerous black columns. Each pillar was embedded with a certain number of skulls. Some of them came from humans, while others came from different creatures. However, their empty eye sockets were tilted downwards, as though they were observing at every living creature that entered the cathedral. Just like most buildings here, every detail in the cathedral could be said to be exquisite, but they formed the elements that lean towards nightmare, horror, terror, and mystery. After getting off the carriage, Audrey saw a grand but empty hall through the main door. In the depths of the hall stood a huge cross. Curled around the cross was a grayish-white dragon statue. Unlike ordinary cathedrals, there were no pews for believers to pray, nor were there places for candle stands. However, in front of the dragon statue, there was a small long table. On both sides of the long table were 5 seats, and the seats at both ends were empty. Polly Durlau wheeled himself to the end of the long table where the seat of honor was. Then, he pointed to his left. "Please take a seat." Audrey slowly followed behind him. She looked around and casually pulled out a chair before sitting down. She wasn't too close to the president of the psychology alchemists, nor was she too far away. She perfectly showed her vigilance and didn't show any signs of guilt. Polly Durlau raised his hands and clasped them together before placing them on the surface of the long table. "Miss Audrey, I have something to ask you. Please speak." Audrey turned her head slightly and responded with her green eyes. Durlau nodded slightly and said, "Would like to know how you advanced to sequence for manipulator. Where did you get your potion formula and beyonder characteristic?" Audrey replied frankly, "It was from a deal. A client wished to receive the help of a spectator demigod, and had paid the manipulator potion formula and beyonder characteristic as an advance." Durlau immediately laughed. "That actually happened? These generous conditions resemble a father finding an excuse to give his daughter a present. Can you tell me exactly what kind of help you provided? Kill another demigod." In this matter, control of one's mind was rather crucial. Audrey simply explained. Her attitude was very calm, as if she was talking about the homework given to her by a teacher. Durlau's long and fluffy eyebrows twitched as he said, "And you succeeded? The results are obvious enough." Audrey gave an answer rather tactfully. Durlau sized her up and realized that the noble girl on his left was a manipulator who could kill other demigods. Audrey read his thoughts and added, "I was just one of the participants." Durlau nodded and said, "Do you know where the client's manipulator potion formula and beyonder characteristic came from?" "He didn't tell me straight with regards to this question." Audrey gave an answer with a sentence she had long planned out. "He? Can you tell me who he is?" Durlau asked after some deliberation. Audrey had been guarding against the other party's virtual persona from infiltrating her mind island. However, she had yet to notice anything abnormal since the beginning. This made her suspect that the other party didn't need to infiltrate her mind. All he needed to do was observe the fluctuations of the surrounding sea of collective subconscious to understand her true thoughts. She didn't make any attempts to hide and calmly replied, "This concerns an agreement between us. I believe honoring one's promise is a moral standard that the entire world approves of. And in mysticism, this comes into play at a deeper level." Having said that, Audrey took the initiative to say, "If you can't really trust me because of my inability to mention this, I'm willing to accept this. I can only remain an ordinary member and use my contributions in exchange for the psychological research materials that are available to me." Durlau smiled when he heard that. Everyone has their own secrets. This is very normal. What I need to assess is whether your secret will affect the safety of the entire psychology alchemists. He looked deeply at Audrey and said, "Then can you tell me how you got to know such a client?" "I remember that I once reported that, before joining the psychology alchemists, I'd already come into contact with some people in a mysticism circle and got to know a few beyonders." Audrey said a truth that couldn't be any truer. As for what the real logical order to the answer was, it was another matter. Furthermore, the matter regarding Vin Rambise's disappearance, which stemmed from the investigation of Furs and Zio, was something both parties had never talked about but had definitely acknowledged. Durlau retracted his hands from the table and placed them by his chest. "There's another thing I would like to ask. When was the last time you met Vin Rambis?" Audrey frowned slightly and said, "I remember that I've been asked before." After Vin Rambise's death, she didn't immediately cut off any contact with the psychology alchemists. She continued to maintain a certain connection with the upper echelons through Hilbert, Stephen, and Escalante. Only when the war reached Backlund did she realize that she couldn't contact the members of the psychology alchemists cell for various reasons. "I need to confirm it in person," Durlau said calmly. Audrey nodded gently and said, "The last time I met Vin Rambis was in Viscount Glaint's mansion. At that time, I hypnotized my two Beyonder friends I knew, as per his instructions, and asked them why they were investigating Viscount Stratford and who the mastermind behind this was. At that time, Councillor Vin Rambus was nearby, ensuring that nothing went wrong with the hypnotism. After he received the answer, he quickly left. After that day, I never saw him again. As she answered, Audrey was still guarding against the invasion of her mind island. However, it was calm there, and nothing happened. This didn't make Audrey feel relaxed. Instead, she became even more wary. She didn't even dare to think about anything related to Mr. Fool and the World Gehrman Sparrow. She was only certain of one thing: as long as she was exposed to danger, Mr. Fool would definitely provide her with protection. It's identical to your previous answer. Derlau nodded slowly. He then looked into Audrey's green eyes and said frankly, I can't use mysticism methods to trace the origins of the Beyonder characteristic in your body. This means that the person who provided it has an unimaginable existence behind him. Audrey nodded slightly but forcefully, expressing that she agreed with his assessment. I can't force you to not cooperate with other Beyonders or make deals. It's unrealistic. I just hope that you can promise not to reveal anything about the psychology alchemists to anyone. At the very least, when you wish to entrust certain missions to others, you have to package them and hide the secrets, Derlau said calmly as he retracted his gaze. Audrey replied without hesitation, I promise not to tell any living creature that isn't qualified to know about matters regarding the psychology alchemists. She took the initiative to amplify the concept all the way to that of a living being to make up for any loopholes in her promise. As soon as she finished speaking, she felt her thoughts surface from her mind island. These thoughts intertwined, turning into an illusory net that seeped into Audrey's mind island, turning into her subconscious. As this restriction net came from Audrey's spirituality, she would be incapable of removing it even if she became an angel. She would lose the intention of talking about the psychology alchemists when she faced non-members of the psychology alchemists or people who didn't qualify to know about them. And she wouldn't realize this. He didn't invade my spiritual island. Just my words alone made the promise turn something substantial. While Audrey was alarmed, her expression didn't show. Of course, she didn't completely restrain herself, as being surprised by such means was an instinctive reaction from a manipulator. Based on this point, she suspected that either there was something wrong with this city that existed in the heart, or that Derlau, the psychology alchemist's president, wasn't just at the level of a saint. Seeing Audrey make her promise, Derlau pointed at the long table in satisfaction and said, From now on, you are a counselor of the psychology alchemists. You can choose a persona mask as your codename. As he spoke, 7 grayish-white masks appeared on the long table. They were rather illusory and abnormally cold. 5 of them were placed in front of the corresponding seats, as though they already had a master. The remaining 2 persona masks are Wrath and Pride, Derlau introduced. They come from the Holy Bible of the Creator from the 3rd epoch. Audrey thought for a second before reaching out her hand to the mask that didn't contain any anger. I choose Pride. Derlau looked at her and chuckled. That was the choice Vin Rambus made back then. Chapter 13 18:7 Counselors Audrey's right hand paused for a moment before returning to normal. She picked up the mask known as Pride. A 50% chance isn't low, she replied to Polly Derlau simply. This was to say that picking the mask that Vin Rambus had worn before wasn't a surprising coincidence. With that said, Audrey wore the cold gray mask on her face. Almost instantly, she felt that she had an additional virtual persona that had appeared in her mind island. This didn't stem from the outside world, but rather, a magnification of what she knew to the extremes. They received very little education. They have to make the right choice under my guidance. Not everyone has enough intelligence. On the contrary, most people are very stupid. Those workers are impulsive and irrational. They are easily enticed by tiny perks and have no foresight. Only with me thinking for them, guiding them, and making decisions for them can they be saved. They are worthy of pity, but they aren't worth communicating with. These thoughts echoed in Audrey's mind, almost making her believe that this was the truth. After all, this was partial feedback she had received from her previous observation and experience. It wasn't something that had been fabricated out of thin air. With a sweep of her gaze, Audrey saw herself from the smooth surface of the long table. On the cold gray mask, her eyes moved upwards, fixing it to her forehead as though she could only see things high above without a care about anything else. It was funny, strange, and secretly horrifying. Audrey fell silent. A few seconds later, she said in a deep voice, "Is this pride?" If it wasn't for the fact that she had long escaped her misconceptions through the exchange between Mr. World, Mr. Hanged Man, and Ma'am Hermit, she might have been truly affected by pride's persona. As for what would happen after being affected, she couldn't tell. "You recovered much faster than I expected. It looks like you haven't lost yourself in the experience of manipulating others," Derlau said approvingly. Audrey replied thoughtfully, "Mr. Vin Rambus has always appeared a little proud." Derlau clasped his hands at his chest and said, "You could tell?" "Only occasionally." "Some details," Audrey replied in 2 short sentences. Derlau sighed and shook his head with a smile. "This mask's influence on Vin Rambus was worse than I expected. Besides, he usually put on a very good disguise. Under this premise, I don't find it strange that he has gone missing. His arrogance will make it impossible for him to see the path beneath his feet. It will make him look down on beyonders who are weaker than him, and this will often bring great danger." Audrey resisted the urge to recall Vin Rambus's death, and asked in deliberation, "These 7 personalities can amplify the corresponding knowledge and emotions to help us realize our own problems, so that we can deal with them directly. At the same time, they will also bring some negative effects, and unknowingly change its wearer's personality?" Derlau nodded slightly. "In the mind domain, it's very difficult to obtain external help that's pure and without danger. One has to have enough internal strength to avoid the corresponding negative effects. You have walked the right path for you to realize this." Audrey was just about to take the opportunity to discuss some questions about the mind domain when she suddenly saw a mask on the table disappear. She subconsciously turned her head and looked at the entrance of the cathedral. She saw a figure walk in through the door. This figure was wearing a 3-piece formal wear suit, and he had a half-top hat in his hand. He wore the mask that had disappeared earlier on. The mouth on the mask was opened wide until it reached close to the ears. Its mouth remained open, as if it wanted to swallow everything that its eyes could see. "This is one of the counselors of the psychology alchemists, Mr. Gluttony." Derlau did the introductions. Following that, the remaining counselors of the psychology alchemists arrived one after another. They were Mr. Lust, Ma'am Greed, Miss Sloth, and Mr. Envy. As a senior spectator, Audrey was the first to notice the difference in their masks. Greed was similar to a gluttony. His mouth reached his earlobes, but it wasn't open. Furthermore, his eyes were closed. Lust was similar to pride, but its eyes were different from ordinary people. They had sunk to the middle of their noses, as though they were looking at people from the bottom. Envy's eyes, ears, nose, and mouth were slightly slanted, and had a gloomy temperament. Sloth's eyes were tightly shut, and its mouth naturally drooped, giving off the feeling that the wearer was sleeping. Seeing all the counselors present, Derlau smiled and said, "Let's wait for another friend. He will be the 7th counselor. 8th, I forgot to count myself." Just as he said that, a figure entered the cathedral's main door. This figure wore a shirt, vest, a black trench coat, and a half-top hat. At a glance, he was a rather fashionable gentleman. However, after some observations, Audrey realized that there was a huge rabbit under the human clothes. Its eyes were bright red and its fur was snow white. The rabbit walked inside, one step at a time, and stopped at the side of the long table. It happened to be beside Audrey. Unfortunately, you only have one choice. Derlau smiled as he pointed at the wrath mask on the table. The rabbit let out a male human voice, I've always been very gentle. It's a good opportunity for me to experience wrath. As it spoke, it picked up the persona mask and wore it on its face. The mask's eyes were wide and its mouth was wide open, as though an angry roar would shout out at any moment. After Mr. Wrath sat down beside Audrey, Derlau clapped his hands and said, I formally introduced the two counselors who will be joining our council. This is Miss Pride. This is Mr. Wrath. They are both demigods and have deep attainments in the domain of the mind. In addition, Miss Pride will be in charge of the greater Backland area of the Lone Kingdom. Upon saying that, Derlau looked at Audrey and said, You might not be aware, but we are rooted in the masses of psychologists, psychiatrists, and the corresponding aficionados. Our strength is mainly concentrated in large cities and not small cities and villages. Therefore, every counselor is responsible for a city and the surrounding area. Then, Derlau continued, Mr. Wrath is in charge of the Lenberg capital, Azhara, Mr. Lust is in charge of the Intis capital, Trier, Mam Greed is in charge of the Fasak capital, St. Milam, Miss Sloth is in charge of the Fainapotter capital, Fainapotter city. Mr. Envy is in charge of the Intis Republic's Tilisai city, Mr. Gluttony is in charge of the Lone Kingdom's Constant city. After the introduction, Derlau added, Our psychology alchemist's mission is exploration, discovery, and research. We do not care about affecting the scope, member numbers, resources, etc. Therefore, we do not have any counselors in the Fog Sea, the Berserk Sea, the Sonia Sea, and the Southern Continent. Of course, there will often be members who go out to the sea to explore the ruins of the Southern Continent in search of ancient history. Heh, I forgot that I'm the king of the Black Throne on the 5 seas. St. Milam, Constant, Tilisai. Nearly half of the counselors of the psychology alchemists are in the mid-seashore region. Audrey acutely sensed a problem. She came from a noble family, and had received good education since she was young. She was no stranger to the geographical location of every city in the northern continent. She knew that Fasak St. Milam, Lones Constant, and Intis's Tilisai were big coastal cities of mid-seashore. Although they couldn't compare to the 3 major cities of Backland, Trier, and Fainapotter city, each of them was quite large. Furthermore, there were many medium-sized cities around them. This made the mid-seashore coast become the most vibrant economic zone in the northern continent, an area with the biggest population. Under such circumstances, it wasn't too surprising that the focus of the psychology alchemists was placed on mid-seashore. Audrey generally didn't think that the psychology alchemists weren't too interested in expansion. After the counselors got to know each other, Derlau turned his head and said to Audrey, Miss Pride, due to the war, Backland's psychology alchemists suffered great losses. We have lost contact with many of the members. I will give you a specific list in the future. You will be in charge of confirming the whereabouts of the members and then organize them again. In this process, I suggest that you don't use your real image and name to finish the tasks. Create a virtual identity to complete them. Vin Rambus didn't do well in this aspect. I think he's a little too proud. Audrey nodded slightly and agreed. Derlau retracted his gaze and said, The second thing to discuss today is the whereabouts of the Mind Dragon in Eastchester County of the Lone Kingdom. The dragon-worshipping customs of the Heartlark village haven't been weakened in the past 2 years. I suspect that the Mind Dragon is still influencing it in some way. Perhaps we can use it to find its whereabouts. Who is willing to handle this matter? After raising the question, he recalled that the newly joined Miss Pride and Mr. Wrath didn't have enough knowledge of the corresponding situation. He simply explained the explorations the psychology alchemists had previously done, as well as the problems that his entire archaeological team members encountered. Audrey had actually participated in some matters in the early stages. Now that she had a suitable reason to intervene, she couldn't help but feel her heart palpitate. It wasn't that she really wanted to hunt the Mind Dragon, but rather, she wanted to communicate with it and grasp more knowledge and secrets of the mind domain. However, she wasn't in a hurry to raise her hand. As a counselor participating in the council for the first time, she would rather miss an opportunity than be eager to showcase herself. This is Lone's matter. It's not suitable for us to interfere. Mr. Lust surveyed the area and said, unless Miss Pride and Mr. Gluttony don't have the time for it. Audrey waited for a few more seconds. Seeing that the Gluttony didn't say anything, she looked at Derlau and said, I will try to investigate, but I need more detailed information. Chapter 13:19 Life-Preserving Incantation. Seeing that Audrey was willing to attempt the investigation mission, Derlau nodded and said, I'll give you the detailed information later, but I have to warn you that this matter is rather dangerous. You must not be careless. Upon saying that, Derlau paused for a moment and said, if you encounter an accident, and you can't solve it by relying on yourself, you can try to say a name. This will bring you salvation. What name? Audrey asked as she had a guess in mind. Derlau's expression immediately turned solemn. It comes from the Holy Bible of the Third Epoch's creator. It involves the highest mystery of the mind domain, and it has a close relationship with something of the psychology alchemists. It's Adam. Adam. Audrey didn't find it surprising at all, but she showed her puzzlement on the surface, as though she didn't know what this name meant. Derlau didn't explain and instead said, as a counselor, you should be in charge of a Grade 1 sealed artifact. However, you and Wrath have just joined the ranks, so there must be an observation period first. Besides, the former committee member of the Backland region, Vin Rambus, has lost a rather important sealed artifact. We are considering whether we should change the usage method of sealed artifacts and allow usage only via an application. In other words, all the sealed artifacts will be kept in this mind city. You usually won't hold on to them, and can only use them temporarily after an application for particular incidents. The woman in charge of Faceax Capital St. Millum immediately shook her head. There is a very serious flaw in this method. That is that we are unable to deal with any sudden accidents. Be it enemies or monsters, once we encounter them, we will not have the time to apply and retrieve the sealed artifact. I believe that the current method is good enough. Everyone wields a Grade 1 sealed artifact to deal with accidents. When there's a need, we can apply for other items. Derlau laughed and said, this was indeed better in the past. But now, you don't have to worry. As long as you have the chance to resist an accident, then you can directly enter this mind city to avoid the enemy and obtain the item. If there's no chance, just as I said, reciting the name Adam will do. You said Adam twice. That entity is probably already watching. No, he might have been watching from the very beginning. Audrey's heart almost beat faster when she heard that. Then how do we enter without your invitation? Mr. Envy asked as he nodded. Derlau pointed at his face and said, from this council meeting forth, you can take your persona mask out of this city. No matter where you are, as long as there are at least 2 humans around you, yes, other than you, you will be able to wear the corresponding persona mask and enter the city. And these 7 masks are illusory. They are closely connected to what you know, and there's no need to store them in a special way. With just a thought, you will be able to take them out of the sea of collective subconscious. At that moment, the man, who was wearing the gluttony mask and exuded a feeling that he was lost in indulgence, thought for a while and said, will bringing the persona mask out of this city affect our mental state and true personality? There will be some effects that need attention. But I believe that you are all experts in the mind domain. You have the ability to resolve problems in this aspect, Derlau said frankly. Audrey was a little worried that these 7 persona masks had something to do with Adam, but she didn't dare think about it in the mind city. She forced herself to rein in her thoughts and replied to what Derlau had said before, I can accept the 2 safekeeping methods of the Grade 1 sealed artifact. I'll patiently wait for the probationary period to end. Miss, you aren't proud, Miss Sloth, who looked like she was sleeping, commented with a smile. After discussing the Mind Dragon in Eastchester County, the other 5 counselors began introducing things that were worth paying attention to in their respective areas as an exchange of information. During this process, Mr. Gluttony, who seemed to be capable of eating an entire cow at any moment and wore 10 rings, said, "The Constant region hasn't been peaceful recently. There have been many miracles happening one after another. First, Constant City was rebuilt overnight. Second, Belton City's citizens collectively lost their memories of a certain period of time. Third, a powerful archmage who grants the wishes of others for pleasure has been wandering the eastern shore of the mid-seashore. He's called Merlin Hermes. Related to this, there's an item known as the fully automatic wishing machine. Other than that, I also noticed something strange. Many rats, cockroaches, and crows in Constant City have lost their souls, days after the city was miraculously restored. Why were you able to sense this problem?" Mr. Lust looked up at Gluttony from the bottom. Gluttony gulped and said, "I've been researching the mind problems of ordinary creatures recently. Rats, cockroaches, and crows are my experimental subjects." The counselors immediately started discussing the direction of this research before the meeting officially entered the 3rd stage. Their academic exchange enriched Audrey's knowledge quite a bit. She listened very seriously and would occasionally share her thoughts and insights. "All right, this conference will end here." After a while, Derlau clapped his hands. Audrey subconsciously wanted to stand up and lead the other counselors into bowing and bidding farewell. However, she quickly came to her senses and continued sitting there, being the penultimate person to stand up. Before leaving, she asked curiously, "Mr. President, does this city have a name?" "Yes." Derlau laughed. "The Garden of Eden." Garden of Eden. Audrey saw that the other counselors were walking towards the door and asked thoughtfully, "There are many cathedrals here. They should represent a faith. I wonder which existence the residents here believe in?" Derlau nodded and replied solemnly, "The omnipotent and omniscient Creator." Garden of Eden. The omnipotent and omniscient Creator. If this wasn't created by Adam, I'll write my name backward. Above the gray fog, inside the ancient palace, Klein looked at the crimson star representing Miss Justice and silently muttered to himself. In addition, to recite Adam when faced with danger as a response would indicate a problem without concealing anything. Ever since Miss Justice entered the Garden of Eden, the true vision provided by Sapphira Castle had been suppressed. Klein could only use Audrey's point of view to observe the surroundings, just like how Queen Mystic Bernadette's fixed viewpoint back on the primitive island. To a certain extent, this also showed the status of the Mind City, Garden of Eden. Klein gently tapped the edge of the long modeled table and conjured a pen and paper to write his thoughts. This wasn't something he couldn't analyze based on his own thinking. Instead, when facing an existence like Adam, he needed to repeatedly ponder and analyze the details. Thus, the words that formed on the paper helped him to read them back and forth so as to notice and make up any missing details. Basic premise: Adam has already advanced to sequence 0 using the full-scale war from before. By becoming a true god, he can be known as a visionary. Miss Justice happened to become a sequence 4 manipulator after Vin Rambise's death. She may be able to convince others, but she can't convince Adam. What does Adam want? Setting up a sequence 4 saint doesn't match his identity as a visionary unless he has another ploy up his sleeves. His real target is the Mind Dragon, or is it me who's backing Miss Justice? Care and vigilance must be enhanced on this matter. We must not be careless. In the Garden of Eden, the cathedral that the psychology alchemists' counselors were using is similar to Adam's corpse cathedral. However, it's only a little similar. The stone columns on its exterior are inlaid with several skulls. There is no corresponding layout inside, and the color is dark black and very gloomy. What does this mean? What does that grayish-white dragon coiling around the huge cross symbolize? The first step in resurrecting the Creator has been successful? Adam is already a visionary. If his father or the original Creator returns, he would be the first one to be unlucky. He is willing to sacrifice himself. This is the meaning of being zealous. That rabbit is suspected to be Hermes. However, as an angel of the spectator pathway, it doesn't make sense for him to not be able to remove Miss Messenger's transformation curse after so long, especially since he has a visionary who can provide help. Did Hermes do it on purpose? Yes, the president of the psychology alchemists, Derlau, mentioned that to the spectator, death only represented the end of one's identity. He can still participate in other theatrical plays in other aspects as another identity. By combining them together, does this mean that once the spectator pathway reaches sequence 3 or sequence 2, they can separate the identities they once held and make them become living people? And even if these identities were to die, it wouldn't lead to the deaths of their real bodies? It does look like the preamble to becoming a visionary. The rabbit that Hermes turned into after being cursed was separated as an identity which later directly participated in the psychology alchemists. What does he want to do? Back then, when the Twilight Hermit Order communicated, he was sitting beside the Emperor. After Klein was done writing, he put down his fountain pen and carefully read the contents a few times, his heart clouded with mystery and puzzlement. In the end, he could only decide to continue observing and be vigilant. And at this moment, Audrey had already taken the carriage she used, exited the Garden of Eden, and returned to the park in Empress Borough with the man-made lake. She wasn't in a rush to pray to Mr. Fool, hoping that there would be a better way to seal the pride mask. She returned to her luxurious villa as though nothing had happened. Chapter 13. 20. Mind Male Susie was sitting by the door, waiting for Audrey to return. At that moment, the golden retriever immediately went up to her as soon as she saw her approach. She even gave a rather talented showcase of her acting by barking and wagging her tail. She didn't ask on the spot. Instead, she kept accompanying Audrey back to her bedroom before asking in concern, "Is it over?" Audrey tersely acknowledged, indicating that there was no problem. "Is there anything I can help you with?" Susie pressed. "Not yet." Audrey shook her head slightly. Due to Susie's concern, she instinctively recalled her previous experience, but to her surprise, she realized that she couldn't recall the image and name of the psychology alchemist's president. To recall even the information that she had learned from the World Gehrman Sparrow, she had to focus quite a bit. To be frank, in front of Beyonders below the demigod level, she could do similar feats as a manipulator. However, to influence a saint in the mind domain and make it impossible for them to sense it was almost impossible unless the other party was hypnotized, unconscious, or enslaved. That gentleman's level is probably higher than I expected. Audrey controlled her emotions and calmly made a certain judgment. She gave Susie a look and got the golden retriever to stand guard outside the door. In her mind, she outlined the character mask that represented pride. Just as she was thinking about this, she felt a slight fluctuation in the sea of collective subconscious around her. With just a thought, Audrey reached out her left hand and grabbed it. She took out an abnormally cold, illusory grayish-white mask. As long as I seriously think about it, will this pride mask come to my side? Or should I say that it has already existed in my subconscious and has been following me? As Audrey carefully examined her mind island, she signaled with a thought that made the pride mask vanish. The ice-cold, illusory grayish-white mask quickly turned transparent and melted into the surrounding sea of collective subconscious. Audrey still couldn't determine where this pride mask had gone. Why did it appear in such a timely manner each time? This made her increasingly wary. She decided to pray to Mr. Fool and make the wish of sealing the mask. Just as she was thinking of doing a few more experiments to obtain more knowledge from pride, she saw the sea of collective subconscious begin to resonate without using her manipulator beyond her powers. A beam of light came from afar as it grew larger and more obvious. Finally, it turned into an illusory letter. This letter stopped in front of Audrey's mind island as though it was searching for a path to complete the delivery. Audrey naturally wouldn't let any foreign object enter her mind world. She hurriedly reached out her left hand and touched the illusory letter. Seeing that her fingers were about to touch the surface of the letter, Audrey suddenly stopped. Her experience and intelligence told her at the same time, don't touch anything in the mysticism world rashly. This was especially so for the mind domain. Otherwise, it would easily lead to corruption and produce mental problems. With this in mind, Audrey produced a virtual persona and put on the black long-veiled glove, Hand of Horror. After making the necessary preparations, she reached out to grab the illusory letter and watched as it peeled away its outer layer and flipped over one page at a time. This was all the information related to the Mind Dragon in Eastchester County. To use the Sea of Collective Subconscious to transmit information. The higher-ups of the spectator pathway are truly amazing. As a manipulator, Audrey had been trying her best to maintain her initial yearning towards the mysticism world. It was a pure and innocent pursuit of dreams and magic. This was one of the ways to prevent herself from losing herself in the manipulating experience of things, and not be assimilated by the Sea of Collective Subconscious. After flipping through all the information, Audrey let the illusory letter melt into the Sea of Collective Subconscious. She was still in no hurry to pray to Mr. Fool. According to her previous arrangements, she went out to be busy over other things. At dusk, before the banquet at home began, she found some time to quickly make a prayer in her bedroom and make a wish. In the next second, Audrey saw the grayish-white pride appear from the Sea of Collective Subconscious in front of her. The illusory feeling slowly vanished as a tiny amount of metallic luster flashed. For some reason, this persona mask had a certain substantial feel to it, as though it was bordering between illusory and realism. This meant that it was isolated from Audrey's mind island in a physical sense. Of course, it also lost the ability to return to the Sea of Collective Subconscious. Audrey held pride and attempted to remove lie that had turned into an emerald necklace, overlapping the two together. Just as she had expected, the half-illusory, half-real pride embedded itself into lie, turning into a blob of patterns that roughly looked like a human face. In the future, I'll use this method to carry it with me. I won't allow the persona mask to have any contact with my mind or body until I need to use it. Audrey's mind raced as she sincerely thanked Mr. Fool. She then left for the banquet hall. Along the way, she met her father, Earl Hall. Good news. Earl Hall laughed. Audrey didn't hide her surprise. Alfred's coming back? This was her other brother. You actually guessed it? Earl Hall said in surprise, in the next half of the year, he will return to Backlund as a general. Half a year. Susie is already a dreamwalker. Audrey thought for a moment and asked, Father, when are we returning to Eastchester County? As the war had just ended and there were many things in the kingdom that needed to be done, the nobles didn't return to their respective fiefs during New Year's. They remained in Backlund all this time. It was already the end of February. Earl Hall nodded and said, about April. In the ancient palace above the fog. Mind mail. Be careful of viruses, don't click on them without thought. As Klein sighed, he threw the curtain that represented the attendant of mysteries beyond her characteristic back into the junk pile, allowing it to cover all the items there. He had just fulfilled Miss Justice's wish using the grafting ability he named. He connected the illusory concept of the persona mask to an ordinary metal mask, and he gave the Worms of Spirit, who were on duty at Sapphira Castle, an order to recharge the powers from time to prolong the grafting effect. From the description of Mr. Gluttony from the Psychology Alchemists, Zeradol seems to have found constant city. I have to be even more careful. Klein tapped the edge of the long-modeled table with his finger, causing Worms of Spirit to appear from his body. His figure vanished from Sapphira Castle. Winter County, Amantha Mountain Range, Cathedral of Serenity. Leonard obtained a document from the Pope. This was the first thing he was responsible for after becoming a high-ranking deacon. After returning to his room, Leonard leisurely leaned back and placed his feet on the desk. Then, he opened the document in his hand and began reading. A wandering magician, Merlin Hermes, grants the wishes of others for pleasure. The newly rebuilt Constant City. Fully automatic wishing machine. Sequence 4 of the Seer Pathway is Bizarro Sorcerer, Sequence 3 is Scholar of Yore, and Sequence 2 is Miracle Invoker. Leonard read until he suddenly fell silent. After a few seconds, he suppressed his voice and asked, "Old man, how many angels of the Seer Pathway are active across the land?" Palaz Zoroast scoffed. "This is acting. There should only be one miracle invoker who still needs to act. You should know who I'm talking about." Leonard looked at the information in his hand again and mumbled, "He's having quite a good time." He had already decided that the main purpose of this mission was to act as a night watcher and digest his potion. He could also travel in passing. As for handling the matter, what mattered was to find a reasonable explanation. After flipping through the thick documents in boredom, Leonard retracted his feet and stood up. He was going to retrieve a Grade 1 sealed artifact that a high-ranking deacon like him could own. To other saints of the Church of Evernight, this was quite a headache. This was because the negative effects of sealed artifacts weren't easily endured. It was even more so when one needed to carry them for a long period of time. However, if one chose a holy artifact that was more compatible with him, there would be a problem of powers overlapping. As for Leonard, he didn't need to worry about this problem. As long as the sealed artifact he was interested in had a living characteristic, he could get Old Man's help. By parasitizing it with a worm of time, it significantly reduced the negative effects of the sealed artifact, making it as obedient as the word of the sea. Therefore, the main thing to choose is its powers. Leonard whistled and walked out of the room. Monday afternoon, in the ancient palace above the gray fog. Dark red beams shot out, materializing into different figures. Derek hadn't needed to count his heartbeat for a long time. All he needed to do was take a look at the wall clock and calculate the time difference with Backlund to know how much longer before the tarot gathering happened. At that moment, he stood up with Miss Justice and the other members of the tarot club. He bowed to the end of the long bronze table and said, "Good afternoon, Mr. Fool." After taking their seats and paying their respects, Emlyn glanced left and right and said, "I want to know if there's something special about the planter and the moon pathways compared to the other pathways?" After raising the question, he didn't hide it and instead added frankly, "I recently learned that the internal system of the Church of Earth is different from other normal systems. It's split into two categories, favored and blessed." After Emlyn finished his simple description, Alger, Catlia, Leonard, and company looked at each other, unable to provide a reasonable explanation. Of course, every member present, including Derek, could tell that the internal system of the Church of Earth was abnormal. At this moment, they heard a soft sigh. This sigh seemed to come from an era more ancient than ancient. It came from Mr. Fool, who sat at the end of the long model table. Chapter 13:21 The 6 Special Pathways. The Fool Klein slowly surveyed the area. He didn't provide an explanation to everyone as they had expected. Instead, he reined in his sigh and asked with a smile, "Where do you think the 22 Beyonder pathways originate from?" This was one of the 3 most important questions in mysticism, with no consensus for the answer. Every school of thought had its own theory, no one could convince anyone. Catlia deliberated for a moment before replying, "The essence of the world is knowledge, and the essence of knowledge is data. Humans are data, and the Beyonder characteristics of the 22 pathways are data. All things are a form of data, and this is how it was born." She had offered the Moses ascetic orders theory, but that was not her own point of view. The 7 churches believe that the Beyonder characteristic originated from the original creator. He transformed into all things, including the deities, humans, sea, land, and beyonder characteristics, Leonard briefly explained. Of course, this is an explanation given to deacons and above. The official beyonders below sequence 6 don't need to know so much. Then, he glanced at Emlyn and said, the life school of thought believes that the world is split into 3 levels. The material world, the world of the spirit, and the world of absolute rationality. Beyonder characteristics are the projections of certain things from the world of absolute rationality into the material world and world of the spirit. Therefore, characteristics can't be destroyed. It only reassembles. From the looks of it, the world of absolute rationality that the life school of thought promotes might be referring to the river of fate. The fool Klein thought of Wuxia, but he remained silent and didn't interrupt the conversation between the members of the tarot club. Emlyn returned a glance at the star and said, as one of the rulers of the second epoch, us sanguine believe that beyonder characteristics do come from the original creator. Then, the various characteristics accumulated and produced the ancient gods. The ancient gods then created different races. This was the sanguine's explanation for the first epoch, and Emlyn already had some doubts about it. After all, he had encountered many secrets thanks to the tarot club. Alger nodded slightly. Although there are many explanations for the origins of a beyonder characteristic, most of them point to the original creator. The Orthodox churches, Aurora Order, and the City of Silver share such a belief. In other words, beyonder characteristics originating from the original creator is quite the prevalent understanding? Audrey asked thoughtfully. The psychology alchemists mainly studied the mind world and the sea of collective subconscious. They lacked complete theories regarding the origins of the beyonder characteristics. Roughly. Alger didn't conceal his views. At this moment, the fool Klein sighed and said, not all of them. He didn't proceed on to give a long story, but gave a rather vague answer. Not all of them. Mr. Fool means that beyonder characteristics indeed originate from the original creator, but not all of them. A small number of them are special cases? Is this the reason for the specialness of the plantar and moon pathway? Alger instantly thought of a lot and grasped the essence of the problem. As it had nothing to do with her, Furs continued listening leisurely. At this moment, she asked curiously, Honorable Mr. Fool, your meaning seems to be that most beyonder characteristics originated from the original creator, and the 2 pathways such as plantar and moon are an exception. Then where did they come from? The fool Klein said simply, the cosmos. Cosmos. Emlyn was alarmed when he heard that. He realized that the matter might be more serious than he had imagined. The Tarot Club had already shared the danger of the underground corruption and the cosmos. All of the members knew that these 2 concepts led to corruption simply from understanding it. When Audrey, Katlia, and company looked at each other, the fool Klein maintained his hint of a sigh and added, not just these 2. He and the 7 Lights had always maintained their contact and had already confirmed that 6 of the beyonders of the 22 beyonder pathways belonged to outer deities. Honorable Mr. Fool, what other pathways come from the cosmos? Audrey habitually raised her hand and asked curiously and warily. The fool Klein replied succinctly, prisoner, criminal, lawyer, and arbiter. The first 2 came from the mother tree of desire, and the latter 2, along with the nation of disorder, came from the son of chaos. Chaos gave birth to order, and order came with its own shadow. Arbiter. Furs turned her head in surprise and glanced at Zio. She had just thought that this matter had nothing to do with her. She could only watch and not worry about it. Who knew that the trouble was right at her doorstep? Zio frowned slightly and looked at the end of the long bronze table. Honorable Mr. Fool, I usually don't sense any abnormalities, nor have I received any divine epiphanies. Other than those from you. The fool Klein smiled and said, the arbiter and lawyer are relatively better. According to his understanding, the influence the son of chaos had on both the arbiter and the lawyer pathway wasn't deep. It was incomparable to the mother goddess of depravity's influence on the moon and planter pathways, and the mother tree of desire's influence on the criminal and prisoner pathways. This outer deity had gone silent, as though he had disappeared. Furs and Zio secretly heaved a sigh of relief. At the same time, they became more wary of the future. With Mr. Fool not explaining further, Emlyn composed himself and said, "The uniqueness of the planter and moon pathway comes from the cosmos. The divine epiphanies I sensed are likely a form of corruption?" Alger looked at Mr. Fool at the end of the long, mottled table. Seeing that he had no intention of speaking, he nodded and said, "Probably so. This is a test for me." Emlyn sighed and said, "I've already grasped the names of the high-sequence potions of the planter and moon pathway. I'm somewhat puzzled about two of them." After becoming a sanguine earl and a high-ranking deacon of the Church of Earth, he obtained the corresponding clearance to access plenty of information that he had never been able to. Seeing the other members of the Tarot Club look over, the World Gairman Sparrow raised his hand to pinch his chin. Emlyn thought and said, "The moon pathway is as follows: Sequence 3, High Summoner; Sequence 2, Life Giver; Sequence 1, Beauty Goddess. The planter pathway is as follows: Sequence 3, Pallbearer; Sequence 2, Desolate Matriarch; Sequence 1, Naturewalker. What I don't understand is that the names of the two potions, Beauty Goddess and Desolate Matriarch, have certain gender inclinations. What are your thoughts on this?" For a moment, no one from the Tarot Club spoke. They looked at each other and thought of a possibility. A few seconds later, Audrey controlled her gaze and said in deliberation, "I remember that Sequence 7 of the Assassin pathway is called Witch. Assassins who consume this potion become witches. This is a test for me." Emlyn's lips moved slightly, unable to say a word. When he learned the name of the potions, he already had a certain premonition, but he wasn't willing to accept it. He hoped that he could obtain another explanation from the Tarot Club. "Don't worry. You have a low chance of becoming an angel. Even if you can, you won't have the chance to be a beauty goddess." Klein mumbled inwardly, but he didn't say any words of comfort. Everyone fell silent. Leonard coughed and took the initiative to say, "I'll share some matters." He spoke at a moderate pace regarding Merlin Hermes, the rebuilding of Constant City overnight, and the fully automatic wishing machine. As he spoke, he shot a glance at the World Klein. The corners of Klein's mouth twitched as he made the World Gairman Sparrow look ahead. "I'll be leaving the eastern coast of Mid-Seashire soon." These were all done by Mr. World? Can he already create such miracles? As expected of an angel, him. Audrey recalled the information the psychology alchemist's counselor, Mr. Gluttony, had shared. She was both surprised and impressed. She didn't use her spectator's powers to conceal her reaction. This was because everyone had expressed the same emotions, except for Mr. Starr, who clearly knew about it. Merlin Hermes. Wandering Magician. Furs noted the name deep down and secretly decided to distance herself from this name whenever she heard it in the future. This didn't mean that she was still afraid of Gairman Sparrow, but she knew something: it definitely wasn't safe around Gairman Sparrow. Something would always be happening in some way or another. Of course, an instinctive sense of fear was inevitable. It was just like how a seed of fear, sown when one was young, would remain even when one became an adult. Granting wishes for pleasure. Fully automatic wishing machine. Is this the World Gairman Sparrow's acting? Alger and Catlia had similar thoughts simultaneously flashing through their minds. Then, they thought of something. Ever since some time ago, Mr. Fool had made everyone pray to him, in the form of a wish, before granting them. He is helping the world digest the potion, or is it that he and the world are from the same pathway? After he awoke, he also exhibits similar characteristics? Little Sun said before that Mr. Fool's actions were a miracle, allowing the city's residents to directly move from the forsaken land of the gods to outside Byam City. With the fact that the World Gehrman Sparrow is still acting, this shouldn't be something he can do. Alger nodded indiscernibly as he made a guess about the pathway Mr. Fool was in. About to leave the eastern coast of Midseashire? Then my investigation will be even easier. I can just come up with a simple conclusion. At most, I can just directly report that Gehrman Sparrow has become a miracle invoker and is acting. Anyway, the people who should know are already aware. Leonard mumbled silently and didn't ask further. At this moment, the World Gehrman Sparrow looked around and asked, "What do you know about the King of the Black Throne, Burroughs Hopkins?" Chapter 13:22 Hold off on something unresolvable. Upon hearing the World Gehrman Sparrow's question, the other members of the Tarot Club had three reactions. Who is that? I seem to have heard of him. He's one of the four kings. Who is that? Why haven't I heard of him before? Oh, I forgot to ask about the psychology alchemists. I was planning on using a more tactful method to seek some suggestions. The first reaction came from Alger, Catlia, and Furs, who had lived at sea for a period of time. The second reaction came from Leonard, Emlyn, Zio, and Derek. The third reaction belonged to Audrey alone. Getting no answers, the World Gehrman Sparrow didn't ask further. His main goal was to use this as a reminder for Miss Justice to bring up the matter for discussion in a way that could bypass the promise she made. Of course, if Miss Justice were to seek help from Mr. Fool, Klein would also use grafting to temporarily connect the bindings formed from her subconscious to a paper figurine, providing her with a period of time that she could freely recount things. This was also a high-level application of paper figurine substitutes. With Klein's current level, he could easily do it within Sapphira Castle. If he were in the real world, he would have to rely on the worms of spirit above the grey fog to control the curtain and provide responses. At that moment, Audrey thought for a moment and said, "Do you still remember that I once pursued the whereabouts of a mined dragon and went to a place where they had customs of worshipping dragons?" Alger, Catlia, and company nodded. Only Leonard and Zio expressed their lack of knowledge of this matter. As this wasn't an important matter, Furs didn't mention it when she first briefed Zio of the general knowledge. After that, she was frightened by Angel of Imagination Adam, and rarely talked about the secrets shared by the Tarot Club in the real world. Audrey deliberated for a moment before continuing, "It's been almost 2 years. A secret organization that doesn't trust me too much suddenly mentioned this matter and has entrusted me with further investigations. They said it's a form of observation. What motives do they have?" She didn't think it was a coincidence. Emlyn recovered and laughed. This should be a test. To him, he was still very far from reaching sequence 1 beauty goddess, and he had no intention of transferring to the planter pathway. Therefore, he didn't need to worry about the corresponding problems for a long period of time. There was no need to worry too much about it. Emlyn's ability to say the word test shows how much he has improved. Of course, this is also because the Sanguine has done too many similar things to him, having to trouble Mr. Hanged Man into telling him that this is a test. The Fool Klein was very satisfied with Emlyn's answer. Of course, he didn't believe that the answer was correct. He only felt that Emlyn's ability to think up to this level was already pretty remarkable. Audrey said disapprovingly, "I suspect that they already know that I'm problematic. They even know where my problem is and which faction is involved. There's no need to test me further." After leaving the Garden of Eden, she had been thinking a lot. She remembered that Mr. World had once said that the Twilight Hermit Order wanted a war that would sweep the entire world. Based on the current situation, this goal has been achieved in the past year. In other words, the Twilight Hermit Order or Angel of Imagination Adam must have used this opportunity to gain quite a number of benefits and experience the corresponding growth. And before that, Mr. Fool informed them that Adam was ever closer to the level of a deity. Combining all this information, Audrey had a preliminary judgment that Angel of Imagination Adam had a high chance of already reaching the divine throne and becoming a Sequence 0 visionary. Even if he wasn't there yet, he wasn't too far. If such a deity who wielded the mind domain cast his gaze over, Audrey didn't believe that her secret could be hidden. At present, she could only console herself that the leader of the Twilight Hermit Order, the mastermind behind the psychology alchemists, wouldn't place too much importance on a Sequence 4 manipulator. On the one hand, she had made all sorts of preparations to deal with the possible accidents. Perhaps that organization is trying to figure how many members we have in the Tarot Club and what their identities are, Emlyn replied with a smile as he continued on his train of thought. Audrey thought for a moment and nodded. That possibility can't be ruled out. As she said this, she shot a glance at the end of the long, model table and realized that Mr. Fool was only listening to her leisurely without giving her the correct answer. This made her feel a lot more at ease. At the same time, she silently decided that she had to be more careful. She had to be able to resolve problems herself, having already reached Sequence 4. In any Orthodox church or secret organization, Sequence 4 was the strongest person in control of an area. At this moment, Alger, who had heard their conversation, proposed a brand new possibility. If that secret organization really doesn't trust you, then it might be an excuse for them to do an observation. Their main goal is to cooperate with us, the Tarot Club, and Mr. Fool. He didn't know why Miss Justice didn't mention the psychology alchemists directly. All he could do was carefully go along with her. This is equivalent to me becoming an ambassador of the Tarot Club to the psychology alchemists. Audrey nodded slightly and said, that's also possible. Then what should I do next? Alger thought for a moment and said, stall for time. Good idea. Furs and Emlyn both expressed their agreement. After Alger gave the overall strategy, he added in detail, try to stall for time and find excuses not to go until the final moment. When you arrive there, start investigating from the periphery and use caution as an excuse to slow down your investigation. If you really can't delay any further, you can deliberately make mistakes in certain matters and create some commotion so that the Mind Dragon can detect it early and eliminate any traces. If that secret organization really has any additional motives, the longer you delay, the more they won't be able to sit still. If they get impatient, they will expose the problem. Katlia nodded. This is the most suitable response for now. I understand. Thank you, everyone. Audrey also felt that Mr. Hanged Man's suggestion suited her thoughts. However, she didn't delay a certain matter. She immediately turned her head and looked at the end of the long, modeled table. She bowed and said, Honorable Mr. Fool, has Angel of Imagination Adam advanced to Sequence 0? Not bad. To be able to be aware of this point. The Fool Klein leaned back in his chair and chuckled. Only with the apocalypse approaching did he finally take that step. The level of the Garden of Eden had virtually confirmed that Adam was definitely a visionary. Angel of Imagination Adam has become a god? This news immediately reverberated in Derek and Company's minds, leaving their minds in upheavals for a long time. Indeed. Audrey pursed her lips and expressed her gratitude before asking, what kind of payment do I need to make for this answer? The Fool Klein surveyed the area and said with a smile, there's no need. It's a reminder. After this topic ended, because most of the Tarot Club members were still immersed in the impact of Adam becoming a true god, no one spoke for a moment. After a few seconds, Derek looked around and probed, the city of Silver has already plowed the surrounding fields and planted wheat and other crops, but the harvest will still take some time. I wish to know what we can do to earn gold pounds and purchase resources. After the initial aid, the Church of the Sea God and the government of the Rorstad Archipelago stopped providing free aid. After all, their financial strength was rather limited. In this situation, the City of Silver and Moon City each sold a batch of Beyonder characteristics and monster hides in exchange for a large amount of funds that could be used to purchase various resources. However, with the entrance to the forsaken land of the gods closed, they were unable to replenish Beyonder characteristics and monster hides. It was also impossible for the City of Silver and Moon City to give up their military strength either, selling large amounts of combat resources and wasting the opportunity of nurturing their descendants. Therefore, once all the gold pounds, gold, and jewelry were used up, they would undoubtedly fall into a predicament. For this reason, the 6-member council had been troubled over how to earn gold pounds from the outside world and how to establish a stable financial system. This was a little beyond their capabilities. The Beyonder characteristics that the City of Silver and Moon City had previously sold were mainly purchased by the Church of the Sea God and the Worsted Archipelago government. They were used to establish official Beyonder factions under them. After all, the number of Beyonders needed to cause damage, and the number of Beyonders needed to stabilize an area was on completely different levels. In addition, the entire Worsted Archipelago only had sea god Calvetua and the demigod cardinal of the Church of the Lord of Storms. This was slightly insufficient for a new government, especially since the Church of Storms and the Church of Sea God weren't allies. After hearing Little Sun's plea for help, the other members of the Tarot Club began to seriously consider what the City of Silver and Moon City residents could do. Audrey thought for a moment and asked, "What are you best at?" "Combat," Derek replied without any hesitation. Alger nodded slightly when he heard that. Although the World War has ended, law and order hasn't been restored in the colonies of the southern continent. It's still very chaotic there, and small-scale wars occur from time to time. You can try to form 2 to 3 mercenary teams and be hired by any faction. Private military contractors. Klein gave an even more modern name to the suggestion. This is a good idea. Derek's eyes lit up when he heard that. Alger asked again, "Combat is a survival instinct. Other than this, do you still have anything you want to do?" Derek replied in embarrassment, "Many people wish to be chefs and brewers, as well as hope to work at candy factories." Chapter 1323 Development Plan. After hearing the City of Silver citizens' wishes, a thought suddenly surfaced in Klein's mind: why is everything related to food? Alger thought for a moment and said to Derek, "You can make people with such thoughts join the industry association in Biome. Seek out suitable teachers through the association, and directly invite people with specialties in such fields to teach in the new City of Silver and provide generous salaries. Of course, the prerequisite is that you have to get the residents to grasp the language of the Worsted Archipelago as soon as possible. On this basis, Loanese, Ancient Faesac, and Dutanese have to be taught too." After the hanged man finished speaking, the hermit Catlia gave her suggestion: "Other than organizing the mercenary teams, you can also try to apply for civil jobs in the various cities of the Worsted Archipelago to handle supernatural matters." Although the Worsted Archipelago government and the Church of the Sea God had obtained a batch of Beyonder characteristics and the corresponding potion formulas from the City of Silver and Moon City, they were unable to nurture enough Beyonders in a short period of time. Sequence 9 was relatively still alright. The chances of someone being selected for their good mental strength and physique to lose control from consuming the potion were actually very small. If one were to further advance, acting might not necessarily be successful, and it also required time. Under such circumstances, as long as the residents of the City of Silver became members of the official faction, they wouldn't be worried about losing their jobs in the future. Of course, the Worsted Archipelago's government would definitely control the number of applicants. The City of Silver wouldn't be able to completely resolve everyone's employment problems using this route. Klein agreed with Mam Hermit's suggestion. Furthermore, he believed that there was a need for him to give a revelation to Danitz, allowing the Worsted Archipelago government and the Church of Sea God to increase the number of official Beyonders to a certain range. This wasn't to help the City of Silver's residents and the majority of the deformed people in Moon City find jobs, but to deal with the impending apocalypse, the deeper corruption of the outer deities, and the gradually increasing frequency of supernatural incidents. At that moment, Cadlia glanced at Miss Justice and continued speaking to Derek. You should now have a large amount of liquid funds. You can try to invest in the mines, spice plantations, farms, and purchase fertile land and forests with rich produce. They're all very cheap now. Yes, although the Church of the Lord of Storms can still influence the archipelago, and although the new government promises to protect the local businesses, there are still a large number of people from Lone, Faisac, and Intis who lack confidence. They wish to cash out and return to their countries as soon as possible. That oracle named Danitz recently bought a spice plantation. Derek recalled what he had heard before and immediately felt enlightened. Cadlia's suggestion gave others inspiration. Audrey immediately added, when negotiating, it's best if you invite some professional lawyers. If not, you'll be fooled easily. Well, if you think there's a need, you can bring along a psyche analyst from the city. Also, you have a medium-sized port that can develop the corresponding economy. While the official Beyonders of the Rorstad Archipelago's government and the Church of the Sea God are lacking in generation knowledge, you can set paid classes designed for outsiders in the new City of Silver savant schools. Well, remove the knowledge that will easily clash with the Orthodox Church. The railway connecting the new City of Silver and other cities must be built as soon as possible. Derek was taken aback when he heard that. He hurriedly raised his hand and said, "Sorry, I need to memorize what was just said. I forgot that he has no foundation in economics." Audrey reflected on herself, closed her mouth, and smiled as she signaled for little son to seek help from Mr. Fool. After Derek conjured a pen and paper and wrote down the previous suggestions, Audrey, Emlyn, the Star Leonard, and the other members of the Tarot Club offered their ideas one after another. They also rebutted the suggestions that weren't mature or pragmatic enough. This intense scene lasted for nearly half an hour before ending. Derek looked at the adequately thick pieces of paper in front of him and couldn't help but smile. He seemed to have seen the beautiful future of the City of Silver. Sitting at the end of the long, model table, the Fool Klein sighed for some baffling reason as his heart felt a lot heavier. If one didn't consider how the apocalypse was about a decade away, the discussion would have been pleasing regarding the promising future that awaited the City of Silver. However, the arrival of the apocalypse wouldn't change because of the will of humans. Even saints and angels couldn't do it. Looking away from the paper in front of him, Derek deliberated and said, "We have already built the temple and cathedral meant for Mr. Fool. We wish to proselytize to various cities in the archipelago. What do we need to pay attention to?" Alger frowned slightly and said, "Have you written a Holy Bible? Have you designed the order of Mass and prayer details?" "Yes." Derek nodded heavily. That was based on his knowledge of the miracles Mr. Fool had shown, combined with the religious scriptures left behind by the Creator. Furthermore, the City of Silver had also prayed to the Fool seeking his thoughts on the matter. His attitude was a tacit agreement. "Has the internal system of the church been set up?" Alger continued asking. Derek subconsciously looked at Mr. Fool, who was shrouded in layers of grayish-white fog, and turned around. "Currently, it's following the internal system of the other churches. The chief of our 6-member council will hold the role of archbishop, and a number of enthusiastic citizens have been appointed as bishops and priests. The City of Silver didn't set up an organization to deal with Beyonder matters within the church, since most of them were Beyonders, and there were already the corresponding organizations in place previously." Alger saw that Mr. Fool didn't object nor agree. He controlled his desire to teach and nodded slightly. "You can try that out first." He paused for a moment before saying, "However, there are 2 things to take note of. First, don't badmouth the other churches, lest there be conflict. Second, it's to respect the current oracle. In the absence of a leader appointed by Mr. Fool, the oracle is the representative of a deity. Third, don't engage in religious harassment during proselytizing. Besides, I have serious doubts about the eloquence of the bishops and priests of the City of Silver. I'll need to get Danitz to find professionals to train them." The fool Klein, who was listening quietly, muttered inwardly. He didn't express his opinion on the Holy Bible written by the City of Silver, because it was a little awkward, but if he objected to certain descriptions, it would also damage the fool's image. With this in mind, Klein couldn't help but lampoon. Perhaps one day, when Wuxia reads the Holy Bible of the Church of the Fool, he would blurt out in surprise, "When did I become an angel under the fool?" Then, Leonard's grandpa, the awakened Mr. Azek, and Miss Messenger, who has been trying hard to recover, will add, "What? Me too?" After the conversation regarding the City of Silver and Moon City came to an end, Katlia looked around in anticipation and said, "Which of you has a sequence 3 beyonder characteristic of the mystery prior pathway?" She had already digested the mysticologist potion for quite some time, but she had only obtained the potion formula from the Moses ascetic order. She was still far from obtaining the beyonder characteristic or the main ingredients. Although she was one of the 10 key members of the Moses ascetic order, the corresponding resources became more valuable the higher the sequence. Even an ancient organization wouldn't squander them freely. Furthermore, Katlia came from the dawn and was less affected by the hidden sage, so she wasn't that trusted in the Moses ascetic order. To Katlia, who had already digested the potion a long time ago using the snake of fate's blood to advance to a mysticologist, sequence 3 should have been a relatively easier stage. However, she was bottlenecked by the ingredients. It might not even be possible for her to obtain one for years or even more than a decade. Hence, she had no choice but to seek help at the Tarot Club. Derek recalled the demigod characteristics that the City of Silver had and slowly shook his head. At that moment, the World Gehrman Sparrow said with a hoarse chuckle, "I suggest you ask Queen Mystic directly." Bernadette had already become a sequence 2 angel. If she had an additional clairvoyant beyonder characteristic in her, she could attempt to separate it. Of course, Klein couldn't be certain that the sage potion that Queen Mystic consumed contained the previous sequence 3 and sequence 4 characteristics. Ask the Queen. Katlia got some clues from the world's answer and suspected that something had happened to the Queen. Okay. She controlled the urge to ask. Klein continued controlling the world and said to Mam Hermit, "I have a long-term mission, help me collect information regarding the hidden sage's sudden coming back to life. You can raise the corresponding remuneration now. Or you can wait until there's a need in the future." Klein was still puzzled over this matter. Although it could be described as a uniqueness suddenly coming to life, it should have happened a long time ago if it was possible. Katlia thought for a moment and said, "That wouldn't be an issue." After another round of exchanges, the tarot gathering ended and the members returned to the real world. In the captain's cabin of the future, Katlia nudged the heavy glasses on her nose bridge and thought about how to write the letter to the Queen. During this process, she strolled to the window and saw Frank Lee promoting the alcohol-free volcano beer brewed by sea microorganisms to the crew. He really has the drive. Just as Katlia sighed, she suddenly frowned. At the Tarot Club just now, Mr. Fool mentioned that the planter and the moon are 2 rather special pathways. They come from the cosmos, and they are prone to corruption. The divine epiphanies they receive are questionable. Frank is a beyonder of the planter pathway. Besides, he once complained that the Church of Earth Mother didn't understand the true will of the Merciful Mother. Katlia's eyes that were blocked by the heavy lens narrowed slightly. Chapter 13:24 Handling. After staring at the deck below, Katlia left the captain's cabin and walked to the cabin's entrance. She waited until Frank Lee carried a bucket of alcohol-free beer over. "Captain, do you want a cup?" Frank raised the large bucket of beer with one hand. Katlia shook her head firmly and asked in a seemingly casual manner, "Is this the will of the benevolent mother?" "No," Frank said rather seriously. "I just feel that drinking liquor that has been altered by a modified sedative isn't good for the body. I hope that they'll be able to accept this drink that has no alcohol inside, other than the smell of alcohol. Of course, this is only a preliminary result and it doesn't involve liquor. After all, it can't use distillation to enhance its taste. Katlia was momentarily at a loss for words as she nudged the heavy glasses on her nose bridge. After 2 seconds of silence, she said, "Do you hear the benevolent mother's voice or divine epiphanies?" "No." Frank didn't think much of it as he shook his head. "Phew." Katlia secretly heaved a sigh of relief. At that moment, Frank casually added, "The benevolent mother's will is in the ears of the wheat, in the milk of cows, in the growth of mushrooms, and in every corner of nature. One can feel it without the need to experience the divine epiphany." Katlia's gaze immediately shot towards Frank's eyes. She didn't find any signs of madness, only pureness. Without another word, she nodded slightly and walked forward. She crossed Frank Lee and arrived on the deck. After taking in the sea's vista for a few minutes, Katlia returned to the captain's cabin. She unfolded a letter and wrote, "I wonder what's your take regarding Frank's actions. He claims that he doesn't obtain any divine epiphanies, and believes that the benevolent mother's will is hidden in every nook and cranny of nature." This was a letter to Gehrman Sparrow. Katlia believed that just by adding such a question, he would be able to understand what she was implying. After folding the letter, she took out a gold coin and began to summon the terrifying messenger. "Ma'am Hermit wrote me a letter immediately after the tarot gathering ended. It shouldn't be related to the hidden sage. It can't be that fast." Klein was on a cruise ship, traveling on the Tussock River. Wearing a black robe, he took the letter from Miss Messenger's mouth and opened it. He finished reading all the content with a glance. "This." Klein frowned slightly. Perhaps it was because Frank had shown enough danger and madness in his usual behavior that he had actually neglected the possibility of this druid being affected by the mother goddess of depravity. Frank had once been placed on trial by the Church of Earth Mother for a forbidden experiment, and then he was placed on a wanted list. If Earth Mother hadn't been corrupted, and the Church of Earth's operations were rather normal, then it means that they believe that Frank is problematic. However, if there's concrete evidence, Frank, who went to the court, probably wouldn't have lived. Klein's mind raced as he attempted to find clues based on his understanding of Frank. There's no problem with the relevant actions. The prayer posture and his usual prayer gestures are different. It's just like how when the Beyonders of the Church of Evernight pray, they won't draw 4 stars on their chests at times. At most, they'll just go through the final motions. Apart from this small problem, there's something wrong with Frank in every aspect. He's like a child raised by the mother goddess of depravity. As these thoughts flashed through his mind, Klein had 2 contradictory guesses. Either Frank's corruption was very hidden, making it impossible for the Church of Earth Mother's tribunal to be certain, or he wasn't affected by the mother goddess of depravity at all. It was purely because he had a mental problem that made him look like a blessed of an evil god. Regardless of which guess it was, Klein believed that the subsequent development wouldn't be good. He remembered very clearly that Frank's mushroom experiment had a breakthrough because he had been given an assistant who believed in the primordial moon. And the primordial moon was one of the manifestations of the mother goddess of depravity. That also meant that from that moment forth, regardless of whether Frank had any problems in the past, he could very well have entered the eyes of the mother goddess of depravity. This wasn't a good thing. Of course, I can't eliminate the possibility that Frank is excessively crazy, causing the mother goddess of depravity to just look away. Klein mumbled in amusement, hoping to make the best out of it. This was nearly impossible. The horror and strength of a foreign god wasn't something a demigod could understand. Klein even suspected that if it wasn't for the overly intense response that would destroy the anchors of the deities, allowing them to attack each other in a frenzy, resulting in the Beyonder characteristics to gather and awaken the oldest one, the outer deities might have already destroyed the sun and destroyed the ecosystem of the world. They weren't able to do anything to the oldest one's barrier, but they were free to do anything to the star outside the barrier. Sometimes, Klein wondered if the astronomically observed sun was real or not. Perhaps it was just the eternal blazing sun that hung himself there. So far, there shouldn't be any major problems with the mushrooms that Frank invented. I've already dealt with them above the gray fog. Furthermore, the residents of the city of Silver and Moon City didn't show any abnormalities. Yes, after they left the forsaken land of the gods, they abandoned farming mushrooms because they lacked monster corpses and had sufficient food. The more Klein thought about it, the more fearful he felt towards it. If it wasn't for the fact that the mother goddess of depravity's powers that could penetrate the original barrier was still extremely limited, Klein suspected that the cards of blasphemy in mushrooms would have left him corrupted. Sapphira Castle would have unknowingly changed owners. These were things that had been placed above the gray fog for a long time and didn't undergo any special sealing. Compared to the flamboyant mother tree of desire, the usually low-key mother goddess of depravity was far more terrifying. Mr. Dor and the Emperor were silently corrupted by her. As expected of an existence that stands atop the outer deities despite losing 2 Beyonder pathways and a Sapphira. Klein sighed inwardly. He took out a pen and paper and prepared to write a reply to Katlia. At that moment, he realized that Miss Messenger had been waiting by his side the entire time without returning to the spirit world. The 8 eyes of the 4 heads stared at him unblinkingly. "What do you think of Frank?" Klein hesitated before asking, other than his nickname. The 4 heads in Rionette Tynker's hand spoke one after another. "He only appears like an adopted son of an outer deity. In other words, Frank wasn't affected by the mother goddess of depravity previously. He was simply crazy." Klein heaved a long sigh of relief. He then asked, "What about now?" As Frank Lee summoned Rionette Tynker every time he wrote a letter to Gehrman Sparrow, Klein believed that Miss Messenger, who had a very high status, had a relatively clear and accurate grasp of the state of the Mushroom King. "I don't know, either," Rionette Tynker's 4 heads answered one after another. Following that, she added, "His body, temporarily, hasn't been corrupted. Does that mean that you can't tell if his psyche is affected?" "That's right, other than his low level, Frank's usual actions resemble more of an evil god than me." Klein lampooned as he took out a gold coin and flicked it. With this medium, he quickly entered a dream divination state. At the same time, he was prepared to activate Sapphira Castle to cut off the outer deities from watching. Scenes flashed past as Klein saw several futures. Yes, the greatest threat right now is that primordial moon believer. I have to separate him from Frank, or things will become extremely troublesome and dangerous. If Frank doesn't come into contact with anything related to the mother goddess of depravity in the future and doesn't advance to a demigod, there shouldn't be any problems. If only one of these 2 conditions is satisfied, the chance of an accident happening will increase greatly. If both are satisfied at the same time, I can't see the developments at all. Klein snapped awake as he interpreted the results of the divination. Perhaps because Frank's level was too low, and he wasn't too affected by it, Klein's divination happened smoothly without encountering any danger. Phew. He silently exhaled and caught the gold coin. Then, he realized that Miss Messenger's 8 red eyes were focused on the gold coin in his palm. Klein twitched his eyebrows, expressing his doubts. "It has Sapphira Castle's aura." Rionette Tynker's 4 blonde, red-eyed heads shook up and down. "This is one of the 5 gold coins I often use for divination. It has already been tainted by the aura of Sapphira Castle? This way, it can be considered a mystical item to a certain extent. However, the effect will be drained over time." Klein carefully looked at the gold coin in his hand and made a rough judgment based on his spiritual intuition. This gold coin could increase the accuracy of divination and enhance a user's ability to resist any interference. To Klein, this was a pleasant surprise. He decided to use the actual gold coin rather than its historical projection. Retrieving the gold coin, Klein wrote a reply to Ma'am Hermit and handed it to her through Rionette Tynker. After giving Gehrman Sparrow's messenger another gold coin, Katlia unfolded the letter and quickly scanned it. After reading it, she felt her shoulders weigh down a little. Without any delay, Katlia took out another piece of paper and wrote, "Your Majesty, I dreamed of you finding that primitive island and successfully returning. The situation of that descendant of the Emperor is getting worse. If he continues staying on the future, I suspect he'll go crazy. If you don't mind, I want to send him over to you. What we need to take note of is that, although he claims to no longer believe in the primordial moon, no one has ever confirmed that. My greatest worry now is that it's difficult to obtain the main ingredient of a clairvoyant. If you have returned, I wish to find a time to return the magic wishing lamp to you." Chapter 1325. More than half a year later, City of Generosity, Bayam, in a rented apartment lit up with gas lamps. Verdu Abraham, who was wearing a pair of gold-rimmed glasses, held a thick stack of information. He was reading seriously under the dim light, drawing a symbol and recording what he deemed useful information from time to time. He left Lone and came to the Rorstad archipelago mainly to avoid being watched by Dorian and his other family members, and focus on studying mysticism. He wanted to find an effective way to save ancestor Bethel Abraham, or rather, reduce the difficulty of the known ritual. However, he hadn't made any headway after half a year. It was as though he had no other choice other than hunting a bizarro sorcerer, a parasite, and a secret sorcerer. This made Verdu rather depressed, but he was clear about how dangerous a Grade 0 sealed artifact was. Even if he was willing to sacrifice himself, he was unable to truly control it. He was unable to guarantee the final outcome. And the most important thing was that he couldn't find any bizarro sorcerers or parasites. They were all saints that were hard to track, with styles that were known for being strange and bizarre. Phew. Verdu put down the stack of documents in his hand and muttered silently, "Don't tell me I can only place my hopes on the fool like Dorian and the others?" Upon thinking of the fool, Verdu couldn't help but frown. This was because there were more and more half-giants promoting the fool's faith in Bayam City, so much so that even he, who rarely went out, heard of it. This made him suspect if he had arrived near the headquarters of the Church of the Fool. If it wasn't for the mysterious knowledge that was spread in secret in the Rorstad archipelago was far beyond Verdu's expectations. Many of them were things that the Abraham family didn't know of, and were extremely useful. He would have left Bayam last month and headed for the southern continent. "I can't stay here any longer. I need to buy ship tickets to East Balam as soon as possible." Just as Verdu made a decision, he began to waver. "Dorian and the fool probably wouldn't expect me to hide in the area that's under their headquarters jurisdiction. Emperor Roselle once said that the most dangerous place is the safest place." After some hesitation, Verdu put down the documents and switched off the lights. With the moonlight from the window, he walked towards the bedroom. At the corner of the balcony in his room, a figure suddenly jumped out of the darkness and jumped over the railings. The figure was like a feather, light and weightless. It landed from a height 10 meters above the ground, without making a single sound. Right on the heels of that, the figure moved through the shadows to the vicinity of the Church of the Sea God and went up the bell tower. Then, he took out a pen and paper and wrote the report on tonight's surveillance before stuffing it into a crack. After the figure left, a howling wind suddenly sounded above the bell tower about 15 minutes later. The report was pulled out from the crack by an invisible hand. As it swept through the wind, it rose and fell into the distance like a bat spreading its wings in the dark night. Not long after, the report plummeted like it had been bound to a rock, landing on a hand that extended out in a hidden corner of the garden. This hand belonged to the Cardinal of the Church of Storms, Alger Wilson. He then unfolded the report and began to read it in the darkness. He was completely unaffected by the lack of light. Even in the dark sea, Alger could see everything around him clearly. Verdu is becoming more resolute in his intention of leaving Bayam. Alger nodded indiscernibly as he came to a conclusion. Over the past half a year, he had been monitoring this member of the Abraham family according to Mr. Fool's instructions, but he hadn't noticed anything abnormal about him. After Verdure left the Rörsted archipelago, his mission would be completed. However, Alger didn't wish for it to end just like that. He believed that he hadn't made enough contributions. All he did was simply monitor a sequence 7 Beyonder without any special characteristics. The hermit had already obtained a sequence 3 Beyonder characteristic from Queen Mystic, and had gathered the corresponding supplementary ingredients and was busy preparing the ritual. This made Alger deeply stressed. Of course, he had also done many things according to Mr. Fool's intentions, but even he felt that there was a huge difference from doing those tasks, with the identity, status, and strength of Sea God. For a moment, Alger wanted to use all sorts of methods to force Verdure Abraham to expose himself, but in the end, he gave up on the idea. This was because he couldn't be sure of Mr. Fool's attitude towards the target. Previously, when the City of Silver and Moon City sold Beyonder characteristics and potion formulas, Alger had purchased some from the Tarot Club. He had used it to secretly nurture a team of Beyonders who were loyal to him. This was how he had people monitoring Verdure. Currently, this less than 10-member team was mostly at Sequence 9, while only a small number of them had been promoted to Sequence 8. As for where Alger had obtained the money for purchasing Beyonder characteristics and potion formulas, the answer was very simple. As a cardinal of the church diocese, Alger could easily save a sum of money for himself. And during that period of time, the minerals, farms, spice plantations, and factories in the Rörsted archipelago were sold at below intrinsic value. As long as one had the funds to buy them, they could earn a lot after a short period of time. More importantly, the Church of Storm's headquarters was quite interested in the Beyonder characteristics and potion formulas sold by the City of Silver and Moon City. They provided a large sum of money for their purchase. The go-between was without a doubt the Cardinal of the Rörsted Diocese, Alger Wilson. It was understandable that some losses were inevitable during such situations. Reining in his thoughts, Alger decided to sell some mysticism knowledge in Biam's Beyonder circles through his shadow guards. He wanted to bait Verdure Abraham and keep him in the vicinity for as long as possible. The main reason is that the City of Silver's preaching has frightened that gentleman. Alger shook his head and muttered inwardly. He then destroyed the report in his hand and walked back into the cathedral. The sky had just lit up, and a young man walked out of the hotel, leisurely enjoying the scenery of Biam's morning. He had just bought the Tina beverage that was packaged with the fruit's shell when he suddenly felt a huge shadow appear beside him. The youth turned his head and looked up bit by bit only to find a 2.5-meter-tall half-giant walking over. "Excuse me, sir, do you have a moment to talk about our Lord and Savior, Mr. Fool?" The half-giant bent his back and tried his best to make his smile appear amiable. The youth drank a mouthful of Tina and pointed to the side. He smiled and nodded. "Sure, but not here." He then walked to a place where they wouldn't be in the way. The seemingly oppressive half-giant followed warmly. "Go ahead." The youth didn't hide his curiosity at all. The muscular half-giant's expression turned solemn. "My lord claims to be the Fool. In the past, the present, and also in the future, he is the great ruler who dominates the spirit world. He is also the king of yellow and black who wields good luck. He is also the landmark when every living being seeks eternal life. My lord lives above the real world and the spirit world. His benevolence spreads across heaven and the land. There are a total of 6 angels under him. The angel of Mercury is the embodiment of fate, my lord's most cherished angel. The angel of death has followed my lord for the longest period of time and is the consul of the underworld. The angel of redemption is my lord's bugle, the messenger of his revelations. The angel of life is the crystallization of wisdom itself. She is the indestructible spirituality that resides in everyone's body." Upon hearing that, the youth laughed. "Your lord is really impressive. He actually has so many angels to serve him. Not only that, the half-giant replied gently. There's also the angel of retribution beside the Lord's throne. He is the Lord's lightning, the Lord's rage, and the Lord's palm. It's all the judge of the fallen and the ones who aren't chaste. In contrast to the angel of retribution is the angel of time. He is a king of ancient times. He eventually submitted to my Lord and now strikes the bell of heaven. Impressive, impressive. The youth sincerely sighed. Upon hearing such a response, the half-giant couldn't help but smile. Then, he described the various miracles that Mr. Fool had performed as succinctly as possible. Finally, he said, it's already been 15 minutes. I won't waste your time. If you're interested, you can go to the Fool's Cathedral on 16th Phillip Street. This is the biggest cathedral in Byam City. The rest are still in planning. The young man nodded. I'll pay a visit if I'm free. After watching the half-giant turn and leave, the youth took out a crystal monocle from his pocket and wore it on his right eye. The half-giant walked straight back to a restaurant and changed into a chef's attire. Baldur, you went proselytizing again? The restaurant owner asked with a smile. When the industry association recommended this half-giant to learn culinary skills from his restaurant, he had been rather reluctant. He always felt that the other party could kill him with just a swing of his arm, and he didn't seem like someone with any culinary talent. However, he was now very pleased with Baldur. Not only was he humble, obedient, and willing to take hardship, he had quite the intimidating demeanor. This scared off the gangsters who had placed their sights on the restaurant. The only problem was that he would go out every morning to proselytize the Fool. Of course, the restaurant owner couldn't say anything since it wasn't working hours, so he didn't mind. Baldur smiled honestly and walked into the kitchen. He said to his good friend, Bon, who had come from Moon City to seek refuge with him, I can teach you how to roast fish today. Bon looked rather normal, but his eyes appeared awkward with one looking up and the other looking down. He was one of the citizens from Moon City who wasn't very deformed, and he had the courage to interact with the people outside. He nodded. I have to pray in a moment. Mr. Fool sent a revelation to get all the residents of Moon City to pray to him at 9 in the morning. We are to wish that we are no longer deformed. Chapter 13:26 Successful Mass. Regarding the matter of praying to Mr. Fool, Baldur raised both hands and feet in agreement. He didn't have any intention of pressing Bon. He prayed for more than a minute after waking up in the morning and before sleeping at night. He would thank Mr. Fool for bringing the pure sunlight, delicious food, and a life of no despair. All right, I'll prepare the ingredients for today first. Baldur smiled as he nodded at Bon. A few minutes later, he brought many bags of ingredients into the kitchen, as if he was carrying a few rolls of curtains. At this moment, Bon found a chair and sat down. He sincerely prayed to Mr. Fool. The great ruler who controls the spirit world, the fool that doesn't belong to this era, I wish to be blessed by you. I hope that you can fulfill my wish of escaping from my deformity, in the cathedral on Phillip Street, in several areas in Byam, in the new city of Silver, and the new Moon City that was located in a forest. Prayers echoed softly simultaneously. The extremely self-conscious Xiaofan, Russ, and company vaguely guessed that Mr. Fool was planning on granting such a wish. As they prayed, their bodies trembled, unable to control themselves. They yearned to be like normal people. They were also looking forward to the bustling and lively Byam. They yearned for the grilled fish made from a secret recipe, the candy factories, and delicacies from all over the world. They yearned for a life to drink, chat, sing, and dance. In the ancient palace above the grey fog, the Fool Klein, who was sitting at the end of the long bronze table, saw bits of pure light light up one after another, forming a majestic sea of stars in front of him. The prayers overlapped and echoed inside Sapphira Castle as ripples appeared. Klein closed his eyes and took it in for a few seconds. He raised his right hand and bent his middle finger, rapping the edge of the long mottled table. An invisible force spread out like waves on the surface of water. It surged into every prayer point of light and landed on the residents of Moon City. Xian suddenly felt something and raised her hand to touch the middle of her face. The next second, she felt her nose. Almost instinctively, Xian stroked that position several times from top to bottom before she believed she had grown a nose and was no longer deformed. She instantly closed her eyes, bent down, and pressed her forehead to the ground. She couldn't help but praise Mr. Fool. The praises around her grew louder and louder, becoming more and more uniform. Russ's eyes separated, Bond's eyes became symmetrical, and in Moon City, every deformed person, or those who were ugly because of the traits they inherited, had broken through their original restrictions and their bodies were transforming towards a state of normalcy. At this moment, be it in New Moon City, the new city of silver, or Byam, they heard the bell of the cathedral ring. Gong! The ethereal gong of the bell reverberated in the hearts of everyone in Moon City. It rang in the ears of every person who heard it, as though it could cleanse their souls and bring them the most genuine feelings towards life. The tears that Xian, Russ, and company held back finally flowed out. They felt their minds and bodies turn tranquil, no longer having a speck of dust tainting them. They subconsciously raised their heads and cast their gaze towards the source of the gong. They discovered that it came from beyond New Moon City, an unknown distance away from where they were. A miracle. A thought suddenly popped into the minds of the Moon City citizens. In the new city of silver that was connected to them, Wait Chermont and company cast their gazes into the distance and cast their gaze towards Byam. The gong came from there. Praise Mr. Fool. They mumbled at the same time as they pressed their right palm to their left chest. In Byam City, Bon adjusted his postures with Baldur, who had tears streaming down his face. They faced Phillip Street and towards the cathedral that belonged to Mr. Fool. They listened attentively and gratefully to the holy chimes from heaven. However, above the grey fog, the Fool Klein was somewhat astonished and confused. The sudden chiming of the bells wasn't within his plans. He then turned his gaze to the Fool's Cathedral at 16 Phillip Street. Almost at the same time, he used the prayer lights to see the tall bell tower that was attached to the cathedral. He saw a young man wearing a pointed hat and a classic black robe standing at the top of the bell tower. This youth was holding a black bell hammer and was striking the bell repeatedly. As if sensing the gaze from above, the youth stopped. He lifted his head slightly and adjusted the crystal monocle on his right eye. At the same time, his smile widened. Klein nearly cursed. At this moment, his eyes glazed over almost in an unconcealed manner. He didn't understand why Angel of Time Amon would suddenly appear and seriously strike the bell of his cathedral. Klein was actually mentally prepared for Amon's and Zeradal's possible arrival. This was because there were just too many people in the city of Silver and Moon City. There was no way they could secretly integrate with the outside world. In other words, the city of Silver and Moon City would definitely be known to the various churches and secret organizations. Under such circumstances, be it public or private proselytizing, it wouldn't affect any future development. Therefore, Klein silently agreed to the city of Silver's attempts to proselytize the faith of the Fool. This was preparation for him to have more anchors for his advancement to Sequence 1. Due to this premise, he was prepared for Zeradal, Amon, and other hidden enemies to come to Byam. He even hoped that they would do so. Here, Klein, who had the status and level of a king of angels in Sapphira Castle, was able to fully display his home ground advantage. As for the City of Silver, it also had Grade 0 sealed artifacts. It could completely resist Amon and take down Zeradal. Compared to his main body suddenly encountering a prepared enemy elsewhere, or the discovery of his marionette city, this was undoubtedly a better choice. However, Amon's current actions confused Klein. He didn't understand what the god of deceit wanted to achieve. 16 Phillip Street, inside the Fool's Cathedral. The Archbishop on duty, the City of Silver's 6-member council's elder, Derek Berg, also looked up in astonishment at the stained glass. Rays of sunlight shone inside, allowing Derek to read one scene after another. As the black bell hammer fell, the tremors of the bell gradually stopped. I didn't arrange for someone to strike the bell. Derek frowned. As a member of the City of Silver, as a demigod in the Sun domain, he had a sharp intuition and knew that something must have gone wrong. However, the strange ringing of the bell didn't bring any accidents. Besides the ringing, everything seemed normal. As Derek observed the surroundings with the help of his unshadowed beyonder powers, he quickly considered whether the bell had any symbolic significance in mysticism. After eliminating the possibilities, he suddenly recalled the Holy Bible of the Fool made up by the City of Silver. There was content related to the striking of bells. It was used to describe the relationship between Angel of Time Amon and Mr. Fool to confirm his true status. Towards that sentence, Derek was still against it because he knew that blasphemer Amon wasn't Mr. Fool's blessed. Their relationship wasn't even harmonious, and was actually hostile. However, the lies he made previously had convinced the other members of the City of Silver's 6-member council. They believed that Angel of Time Amon was the first entity appointed by Mr. Fool to cast down the light for the people of the forsaken land of the gods. It was because he had parasitized Derek, which had resulted in the subsequent changes, all the way until hope descended. Derek had wanted to explain, but he was embarrassed. That would only bring up too many lies, making him lose his image with the other elders of the 6-member council and citizens of the City of Silver. It was just like Miss Justice had said before, a social death. Finally, he chose to delay any actions, hoping that Mr. Fool would take a look at the Holy Bible. If there was anything inappropriate with the descriptions, he would definitely send a divine revelation to change the views. To his surprise, Mr. Fool didn't say anything and silently agreed with the contents of the Holy Bible. Could it be that Amon is striking the bell? Derek was momentarily dazed as he found it too unbelievable. He hurriedly lowered his head and began praying, reporting this matter to Mr. Fool. Above the gray fog, inside Sapphira Castle. Before Klein could eliminate Amon, the other party suddenly turned transparent and transformed into a beam of light before vanishing from the bell tower. What does this fellow want? If his father is the Emperor and not the ancient sun god, then I can reasonably suspect that he is striking a death knell for me. As Klein checked if there were any Amons lurking in the bodies of the City of Silver and Moon City citizens, he analyzed Amon's motives without any clue in mind. Just as he was about to use divination to seek clues, Derek completed his prayer. Holy Bible, Holy Bible? The corners of Klein's mouth twitched as he summoned from the junk pile the Holy Bible that the City of Silver had sacrificed to him. Previously, he had only flipped through a few pages, but he was too embarrassed to continue reading it. He took on a position of burying his head in the sand. Of course, he wasn't careless in this aspect. He was still extremely cautious. He used divination inside Sapphira Castle to confirm that the Holy Bible wouldn't bring him any harm. With this premise, he allowed the City of Silver to use this Holy Bible. He slowly took a deep breath and reached out his right hand. He flipped the scriptures page by page. His facial muscles began to twitch, and the corner of his lips uncontrollably parted. Klein flipped faster and faster. Finally, he saw the last page. Pa! Klein suddenly closed the book and threw it back onto the junk pile. After this miracle in Moon City, yes, the potion has mostly been digested. The Marionette City will have to step onto the stage of history. Klein observed his condition without expression and nodded indiscernibly. Ever since he had gained preliminary control of Sapphira Castle, he could receive digestion feedback from the real world. Chapter 1327 3 Plans. As for the Marionette Town, Klein had been thinking about how to build it a long time ago. He had already come up with 3 plans, if he eliminated any interference from external factors, his best choice would be somewhere in a certain country of the northern continent. He would allow his marionette town to rise up overnight. Furthermore, he would connect it to the surrounding cities through railways, rivers, and roads. This way, the marionette town would have large numbers of outsiders arriving on a daily basis, and it would create a very strong interaction with the surrounding areas. On the one hand, a town without a city nearby would definitely purchase grain, salt, cloth, ores, sugar, and other daily necessities. On the other hand, it would also produce its own products, which could be sold to neighboring cities, towns, and villages. Under such a situation, merchants, workers, tourists, and other groups would go back and forth frequently. At the same time, they would interact more with the marionette town's residents. Under the influence of all kinds of interactions between the parties, it wouldn't be long before the town of marionettes could produce a corresponding region in the spirit world. Once the lives of the residents became more detailed and real, Klein could consume the potion to advance to sequence 1 attendant of mysteries. This would take less than 3 months. But the problem was that this approach couldn't be kept confidential. In the present era, to have a town suddenly pop up was something that couldn't be hidden from people. Soon, there would be civil servants, the police, and reporters coming to investigate. And after that, the interactions between the parties would also make more and more people know and understand the city. This was a problem that couldn't be resolved through illusions unless the town of marionettes didn't interact with the surrounding cities, towns, and villages and had relatively minor interactions. However, that wouldn't meet the requirements of the ritual. When news of the marionette town spread, Klein would undoubtedly be targeted by Zeradal, Amon's true body, and his other enemies. When the time came, the destruction caused by others would definitely be easier than him protecting it. He could only migrate his marionette town elsewhere. This would cause the interactions generated in the early stages to be for naught, just like what the dark demonic wolf had experienced. Therefore, Klein had only listed down such a plan, so he basically wouldn't choose it. Unless a certain visionary was willing to provide help, making all the living beings in the northern and southern continents naturally believe that there was indeed a town there, one that hadn't suddenly appeared. Considering the influence of various external factors and his beyonder powers, Klein's best choice was to establish the town on an uninhabited island that deviated from the safe sea route and was sufficiently well hidden. He would then use Sapphira Castle to give it anti-divination and anti-prophecy properties. At the same time, Klein would use the curtain to graft some roads, rivers, and railways to somewhere outside the marionette town, making it a stop for random groups of people during their journeys. This couldn't be kept completely confidential, but once the strange phenomenon spread and attracted Zeradal's and Amon's attention, Klein could easily remove the original grafting randomly and switch the entrance. Under such a strategy, the movement was limited to the entrance, not the marionette town itself. The effects of various interactions in the spirit world could be preserved without being interrupted. The ritual could steadily proceed as planned. Of course, there was a big problem with this plan. It was that the interaction would be limited and couldn't influence matters at a daily level in all its aspects. In addition, the frequency and intensity of the interaction wouldn't be too high. If he chose this plan, it meant that Klein had to spend more than half a year or even a year on the ritual. If he wanted to be safe, forcing every marionette's fate to have a beginning and an end, the ritual would take at least 50 years. However, there was also a way to get around the limitations. Once the rest of the ritual's requirements were met, he could deliver a meteorite strike, an earthquake, or a volcano eruption to the town, causing all the marionette's fates to come to an end in the real world. It was something that happened in real life and was rather reasonable. In this radical and conservative proposal, Klein had another solution. It was to replicate a city and make the marionette correspond to the residents of the city and be mapped one-to-one. For evil miracle invokers, they could wipe out the original city and use their marionettes to replace its inhabitants. Those who had a kind heart would hide the city and ensure a supply of goods. The reason as to why one didn't convert the target city into marionettes was that it already had a corresponding region in the spirit world. Without being a newly born one, it didn't meet the requirements of the ritual. With the curtain formed by the attendant of mysteries beyond her characteristic, Klein could make a better choice: graft a city at a particular stage to his marionette town. This meant that his town of marionettes had become the dark side of the city. In the corresponding period of time, outsiders would encounter marionettes and not real people. Once that period of time passed, they would leave the town of marionettes and return to the real world to deal with real people. During the process, Klein would send his marionettes to act as an outsider and maintain interactions with the corresponding real person, allowing the real outsiders to return to the real world without any gaps. In other words, there were two different lives playing out in the same city at the same time, but no one could notice that. Occasionally, some people would think that some details weren't right, but would find it inexplicable and might just ignore it. This was rather in line with the characteristic of an attendant of mysteries, and it had a certain level of concealment. Of course, this plan also had its problem. It was to simulate the fate of a marionette to a very high level, almost as similar as a human's. Without its own independence, it would cause the ritual's effects to fail. Klein tapped the edge of the long-modeled table with his fingers and was in a dilemma over the second and third plan. After a few minutes, he did as his heart willed, cowardice, and chose the second plan. He would rather spend more time than affect the fates of the innocent. Back then, Zeradal and Antigonus likely chose the third plan. Klein sighed and prepared to return to the real world. At this moment, he looked at the junk pile and considered whether he should send a revelation to change the descriptions in the City of Silver's Holy Bible. To a deity, the Holy Bible wasn't anything too important. Its best use was for its convenience to spread its teachings and increase the number of anchors. Klein had long come to a conclusion from the revelation of Evernight, the Book of Storms, and the contents of the various Orthodox churches' holy Bibles. Most of the content elevated the Orthodox deity, making random claims of grandeur and expressed mercy and pity. In ancient times, the impression the believers had of the deities would indeed have a negative impact on the deities. But now, with the use of symbols instead of statues, this latent problem no longer existed. At the very least, the Evernight goddess, the Lord of Storms, and other deities openly declared that they were parts of the Creator's original body. They weren't worried that it would exacerbate the awakening of the oldest one. In other words, if there really was a problem with this aspect, Klein believed that the Evernight goddess would definitely have changed the corresponding description. She would have changed the description of being one of the eyes of the Creator to a child spawned by him. It too enjoyed a very high status. At the same time, the believer's acknowledgement of certain matters wouldn't have any burden on the deities themselves in a mysticism sense. Otherwise, Amon would have secretly helped Klein, or rather, prepare a batch of believers for the former Sapphira Castle to lure them into forming the belief that the Angel of Time was the manifestation of the Lord of the Mysteries. With the aid of an instinctual response that met the requirements, he could establish enough connections with Sapphira Castle and open a back door. To a deity, the Holy Bible only had two important components other than for spreading the faith. Firstly, it was a description of the authority and honorific name of the deities themselves. If there were any mistakes, it would lead to the prayers of the believers pointing to an unknown target. Not only would it be dangerous to the believers, but it would also cause the deities to lose their anchors. Secondly, any descriptions that involved the other churches would easily attract conflict. As for the angels and saints, the deities actually didn't pay them too much mind. The ones that cared were the angels and saints themselves because they needed to obtain a certain level of anchors through this. Therefore, the Holy Bible's descriptions of angels and saints were detailed enough. They had authority and honorific names, making it easier for different believers to choose and be immersed. In addition, this wasn't enough to form a stable anchor, because it was under the faith of a deity. In order to resolve this problem, the Orthodox churches would define certain cathedrals to different guardian angels and guardian saints and clearly differentiate them. Due to this knowledge, Klein didn't pay much attention to the Holy Bible. After he finished reading the description about his authority and honorific name, he stopped continuing out of embarrassment. He only used divination to confirm that the contents wouldn't result in a conflict with the Orthodox churches. After some thought, he gave up the idea of directly sending the revelation to change the Holy Bible and decided to use a gentler method. During the Tarot Club's exchange, he could use the World Gehrman Sparrow to guide the Sun into adjusting his understanding of the situation, turning the parts involving the Angel of Time to Pallas Zoroast, allowing the corresponding content to be fixed without causing any suspicion in the City of Silver. Byam, Verdu Abraham had obtained quite a bit of mysticism knowledge in a few Beyonder circles. He lit up the gas wall lamp and carefully read it in the night. Towards the end, he suddenly read a piece of news that he had never understood before. Bansi Harbor is a place filled with mysticism powers. Its connection with the spirit world and the astral world is beyond imagination. Even with the Church of Storms directly destroying the harbor, it still can't completely eliminate the abnormality of its existence. Many mysticism researchers are purchasing items related to Bansi at a high price. Bansi. Verdu muttered to himself silently, suddenly having a strong interest in the harbor. He began considering if he should buy some items from Bansi and do a thorough study of them. After all, the spirit world was related to teleportation. The astral world and the cosmos involved wandering, and might involve Mr. Dor Bethel Abraham's method of escaping. Perhaps, if I have the chance, I could go to Bansi to take a look. Verdu nodded indiscernibly. Chapter 1328. The preparations needed. The initial preparations for building a marionette town were rather boring and tedious. At the very least, Klein believed so. In the ancient palace, Klein sat on the high-back chair belonging to the fool, holding a fountain pen. There were ordinary pieces of paper with the name, age, and the fate of every marionette. As he made the worms of spirit emerge from his body, they formed avatars beside him. Some Klein sat on the ground, while others occupied the 21 seats other than the fool's. Some conjured beds and lay on them. Then, they summoned different books from the junk pile and started reading them seriously. The books included but were not limited to, How to Brew Wine, Train Dispatching, Desert Making Compendium, A Clergyman Prepares, Gas Wall Lamps, Gas Meters, and all kinds of family machinery repair, Desilicacy, Harbor Management, Foundations of Law, Ladies' Aesthetic, magazines. These were specialist knowledge that different marionettes needed to grasp. Only by doing so would they be able to act their roles well, allowing him to be realistic in every aspect. Even if they were to engage in a deep conversation with outsiders, they wouldn't expose any problems. It wouldn't be difficult for Klein if he just needed to simply memorize the knowledge, but he had to truly grasp and apply it. Furthermore, he couldn't confuse his characters. He couldn't let a burly and strong switchman with a low income be talking about the wonders of a particular skin care product, or which silk cloth was flawed. If such a situation were to happen in novels, plays, and operas, it might create a strange attraction, but putting it in the real world was clearly uncanny and not beneficial to the advancement of the ritual. To avoid such a problem, Klein could only work harder in the early stages. He hoped that every character in a marionette town would be real, whole, and appropriate. Fortunately, there weren't many people in a city who needed to deeply understand the corresponding specialist knowledge. Most of the residents were half illiterate, or really illiterate. They relied on experience to live their lives that they repeated via motions. For these characters, the knowledge that Klein needed to grasp was relatively little, just like workers who had gone through simple training, or even without any training, to be sent to the assembly line. After an unknown period of time, Klein put down his fountain pen and rubbed his temples, letting out a long sigh of relief. He had finally written down the information about nearly 5,000 residents in the marionette town, and his corresponding knowledge preparation was almost complete. This is like a super large-scale movie directed by a director, and with me being the scriptwriter. Same for the lighting engineer, the makeup artist, and all the actors. For this ritual, I'm really on the verge of losing control. If I'm not careful, my personality will dissociate and I'll fall into the abyss of madness. Luckily, I have a professional psychologist. Yes, I have to pay attention to a problem in the town's operations. Although I'm a gentleman with manners, most of the residents in town have low socioeconomic status. Be it speaking or acting, they're more inclined towards being vulgar. I can't make a mistake during the acting and become set back by my psychological barriers. Klein sighed silently as the avatars around him disintegrated into worms of spirit before he got them to burrow into his body. Of course, this wasn't all. There was also one, Klein, who maintained his previous state, preparing to be on Sapphira Castle duty. In the next second, Klein returned to the real world and took out creeping hunger from the historical void. Then, he teleported to an island that was located in the Berserk Sea but one that clearly deviated from the safe sea route. This was the stage he had chosen before. This place was isolated from the storms all year round. There were no signs of human activity, only a large forest and animals that lived off the forest. Klein looked around and chose an open area. He pressed his right hand to his left chest and prayed sincerely, "I wish that there's a city suitable for 5,000 people here." Just as he said that, Klein raised his right hand and snapped his fingers. Suddenly, this open area became extremely flat. The surrounding forest also receded greatly, providing large amounts of wood, stones, and soil. Almost at the same time, buildings rose up from the ground. They took form with stone and wood. The highest wasn't more than 4 stories high. The style was closer to the Lone Kingdom's Desi Bay. In just the blink of an eye, residential buildings, a library, a police station, a telegraph office, a city hall, a small hospital, a candy factory, a water plant, a gas company, a steam locomotive station, parallel train tracks, and plantations outside the city took form. The streets were also paved with cement or stone bricks. Towards the end, on the square in the middle of the town, a pointed-tip cathedral emerged from the ground and stood proudly. This was a cathedral belonging to the Evernight goddess, as it was in line with the background setting of the city. I hope this island has a deep-sea harbor. Klein didn't stop as he made a second wish. Pa! He snapped his fingers again, fulfilling his wish. About 3 kilometers away from the town, a small-scale harbor quickly took shape. There were 2 docks, 5 warehouses, a port hotel, a simple restaurant, a police station branch, a bar, a lighthouse, and a naval base. I wish for the harbor and town to have convenient transportation. Klein made a third wish. He raised his right hand and snapped his fingers. A concrete road and a cargo rail instantly appeared between the town and the harbor. According to Klein's plan, a portion of the harbor was prepared for visitors by sea. The town was mainly for outsiders from the northern and southern continent. As he looked at the empty city with admiration, Klein pressed his top hat and teleported to the municipal square. He walked step by step into the cathedral named St. Ariana Cathedral. The cathedral's door was open, and it was dark inside. After an unknown period of time, 3 figures appeared at the door. They were a 30-year-old gentleman in a formal suit with a tie, an ordinary-looking and gentle-looking woman, and a child who was dressed like an adult. The woman took a few steps with difficulty before stretching her neck. Then, she smiled and reached out her hands to hold the gentleman's arm. The gentleman had a faint smile on his face. As he allowed the lady to lean on him, he reached out his right hand and held the boy. The little boy was skipping about, appearing very lively. Their actions were a little rough at first, but the more they walked, the smoother they became as they walked through the square. After they left, more and more people walked out of St. Ariana Cathedral. They consisted of the police, repair workers, gas company employees, restaurant chefs, white-haired old men, and simply dressed farmers. In the next hour, people constantly came out of the Evernight Cathedral. They either turned to different streets and went to different places, entering different houses, stopping at the square, or enjoying the pigeonless scenery. During this process, the number of people that came out had exceeded the limits of the cathedral's capacity, but there seemed to be no end to the people, as though the interior was connected to another city. After another 15 minutes, the entrance of St. Ariana Cathedral finally fell silent. However, there were rats, cockroaches, moths, ants, flies, and mosquitoes creeping outwards. Finally, a colorful window at the top of the cathedral opened. White pigeons flew out and landed in the middle of the square. The people who had stayed there came to life completely. Some teased the pigeons, others looked for hawkers, while some played a 7-string guitar, and others smiled as they conversed with their friends. A man wearing a top hat and a trench coat and carrying a cane left the municipal square. He came to the other side of the town and stopped in front of a wooden board. He took out his tools and wrote the name of the town on the wooden board, Yarnum. After some thought, the man wiped away Yarnum and wrote another name, Utopia. Backlund, inside the Hall family's luxurious villa. Alfred has already boarded the cruise ship back to the northern continent. Audrey didn't hide her surprise. It was September 1352. In the past half a year, Audrey didn't spend too much effort to make her father give up the thought of returning to Eastchester County for the first half of the year. This was because there was a pressing need to rebuild Backlund and Constance City. The kingdom's political scene also needed a new balance. Earl Hall had too many things to handle and wasn't in the mood for a vacation. Therefore, whenever Earl Hall was put in a difficult spot, she just needed to take the initiative to say that she was willing to remain in Backlund and return to Eastchester County in the next 6 months to have things develop as she wanted and receive praise for. As for the psychology alchemists, they didn't rush her either. Up to now, the Psychology Alchemists' Council meeting had been held 3 times. It was mainly to communicate their research results and the various information of the areas under their jurisdiction. Only Ma'am Greed had asked about the clues to the Mind Dragon twice. To be frank, if Mr. Fool hadn't reminded Audrey to take note of the rabbit, Wrath, and the easily forgettable president, she would definitely find the conference interesting. Mr. Rabbit had plenty of ideas, but she remained as vigilant as ever. Yes, the liner has already left the harbor. Earl Hall smiled and nodded. When Alfred arrives in Backlund and completes the necessary social intercourse, we will return to Eastchester County for fox hunting. Autumn was the best time to hunt foxes. Audrey tersely acknowledged. All right. As a major general in the army, Alfred didn't follow the naval fleet to Desi Bay. Instead, he led his adjutants and squires and boarded a steam-powered sailboat hybrid for Pritz Harbor. After traveling for nearly 2 days, they encountered a storm in the Berserk Sea. As the ship shook violently, the sailors on the observatory saw some light through their telescopes. It came from a lighthouse. Author's note: I wrote in detail 3 plans in the previous chapter because I felt that the 3rd plan was most impactful, but it's impossible for Klein to undertake it with his character, so I had to unfortunately give it up. I specially wrote it out for all of you to have a sense of what's the most bizarre and mysterious method. Chapter 1329. A night without any abnormalities. The liner passed through the storm and approached the lighthouse. A small-scale harbor entered the sights of the captain, sailors, and passengers through the gloomy rain. A short while later, a man in his 30s, who was wearing a blue uniform and holding onto a black umbrella and a glass lantern, appeared at the dock. He used rather uncommon actions to guide the liner to moor. As the man watched the gangway lower, he opened his mouth and shouted, "Hey matey, where do you come from?" After most of his voice was swallowed by the wind, his voice successfully reached the liner's interior and entered Alfred's ears. "Do you know what this place is?" Alfred looked carefully at his adjutant and squire. He wasn't wearing a general's ceremonial attire. Wearing a black trench coat that was commonly seen in Backland, his dazzling blonde hair drooped down casually, and his blue eyes looked like a deep lake in a forest. The adjutant, who had neatly combed his hair to the back, first shook his head to indicate his uncertainty before he explained, "The storm from before made me lose my bearings." At this moment, the captain held an umbrella and came to the shipboard. He answered the man, "We left East Balam 2 days ago and unfortunately encountered a storm." "What harbor is this?" The man's eyes darted around for a moment. Without giving a direct answer, he shouted, "Wait a moment, will ya?" He then turned around, holding the umbrella and the lantern as he ran towards the buildings near the dock. This reaction was beyond the expectations of Alfred and the other passengers, but it wasn't strange for the experienced ship captain, first mate, and others. They had encountered many abnormalities at the ports along the Berserk Sea. This made them patiently wait for subsequent developments. 5 to 6 minutes later, the man led a lady over. The woman didn't have an umbrella and was wearing a hooded raincoat smeared with Donningsman tree sap. As the two of them approached the liner, under the watch of the armed sailors, they climbed up the gangway to the deck. At such a distance, most of the passengers finally saw what the two of them looked like. The man had brown hair and brown eyes. His skin was rough, and it was obvious that he was of a lower socio-economic status and had suffered the elements. The woman was in her 20s, and her eyes were limpid green. She had long, flaxen hair. A few wet strands clung to her face, making her appear pure and charming. This was a rather pretty lady with a wild temperament. "Hi there, this is Utopia Harbor," the man impatiently introduced. "I'm Theodore, the interim port captain." As he spoke, he laughed, as though he was happy that he had invented such an amazing position. Of course, the ship captain knew what a so-called interim port captain meant. He didn't take it to heart about this sudden happiness of a small fry. He frowned slightly and said, "Utopia Harbor? Why haven't I heard of it?" Theodore looked at him and said, "What ye said is quite common. Heh, if it weren't for that landlubber hurricane, ye might never come here." Without waiting for him to say anything else, the lady rushed forward and said, "Utopia isn't on the safe sea route. Usually, only people who understand these waters and know of this place will come here for supplies. So the main clientele of this harbor are pirates?" How could the ship captain not be able to tell what she meant? And in times like this, tacitly acknowledging things without exposing them provided protection to both sides. He tersely acknowledged and said, "And you are?" "My name is Tracy." The lady smiled. "I'm the owner of the Harbor Hotel, and also its receptionist and attendant." She surveyed the area and said, "It's quite a heavy storm, and the ship will be bumpy. It's not a wise choice to stay in there to rest. The hotel will provide you with stable beds, warm water, clean food, warm blankets, and an environment that will remind you of home. It's only 10 pence a night. I'm referring to the price of a single room. Other than that, you guys can still drink at the nearby bar and enjoy our warm hospitality." Clearly, this lady was here to solicit for business. The captain was rather alert and didn't respond directly. He nodded and said, "I can't decide on behalf of the passengers. They are free to choose for themselves. Of course, as captain, I will stay here with my crew." Tracy maintained her smile and said, "I'll wait at the hotel for guests who are willing to disembark." She seemed to have received a certain amount of education. She wasn't as hot and spirited as the women at other ports who spewed vulgarities with every sentence. Tracy turned around and was about to return when Theodore approached her and said with a sullen expression, "You have to thank me for telling you the news immediately." As he spoke, his right hand pressed against Tracy's butt before he pinched hard. "Pa!" Tracy swatted away his hand and chided, "You're a jerk who should be fucked by a donkey." She took a few steps forward and left the liner by the gangway. Theodore shook his hands and cursed with a smile, "Bitch." This scene suddenly moved many passengers on board. To them, the biggest flaw on the ship was that it was boring, and there was a bar at the harbor. This meant that they could meet cheap street girls who were unlike those from the northern or southern continent. There were local street girls with their unique local charm. If one was lucky or willing to spend a lot of money, one of them might even be able to sleep with that spirited beauty with an attitude. Instantly, many passengers packed their luggage and prepared to head to the harbor hotel. Upon seeing this, Alfred's adjutant asked, "General, are we getting off the ship?" Alfred shook his head slowly. "We don't know anything about this place. We have to be careful. Staying on the ship is the best choice." The adjutant had no objections to this. He asked worriedly, "What about those who have already alighted?" "That's their choice." Alfred looked out of the window expressionlessly. "If an accident happens, we can only keep more people safe. If it's not serious, then we will be able to resolve it easily." With that said, he turned to look at his adjutant and squire. "We'll take turns to keep watch tonight to prevent any accidents." Alfred, who had interacted with the numinous episcopate, the Rose School of Thought, and other organizations in the southern continent, had an instinctive sense of vigilance towards unfamiliar places. After he exchanged his opinion with the ship captain, Alfred got into bed, listening to the strong winds hitting the glass windows and the torrential rain pattering the deck. He was about to doze off. At this moment, he heard a tender and sad melody coming from the direction of the harbor. It seemed to come from a flute, intermittent like a human whimpering through the storm. Alfred was instantly immersed in the music. It was as though he had returned to Backland, which always appeared in his dreams. He returned to a state that was a mixture of his happy childhood days, the vexing times of his youth, and other emotions. He shook his head violently and shook off the feeling. He realized that it wasn't a psychological effect, but a normal person's reaction. Alfred rolled out of bed and walked to the window. Using his Sheriff Beyonder powers, he confirmed that the music he had heard had come from the cheap hotel. It's not from the guests on board the ship. Their goal is very clear. They wouldn't be in the mood to play such a melody. There are tourists in Utopia to begin with, or could it be that owner and part-time attendant named Tracy? If it were her, she would be a lady with a story. Alfred sighed and retracted his gaze. He stopped pondering over the matter. Although he was curious, he had no intention of getting off the ship. Soon, the sound of the flute stopped. The harbor hotel regained its silence and nothing unexpected happened. Just like that, time passed, and as the storm stopped, the sky gradually brightened. At 8 in the morning, the liner passengers returned one after another. Every one of them had weak steps and looked haggard. Upon seeing this, the sailors immediately laughed and said, "The chicks here seem pretty good." The passengers shook their heads at the same time and looked regretful. One of them rubbed his temples and said, "The lanty proof here isn't bad. It's cheaper than other places. I wasn't careful and had a little too much to drink and ended up falling asleep. I don't even know if anything happened with that babe. Sigh, I woke up to realize that the ship was about to leave, and I don't even remember what I did after getting drunk. Praise the lady. She let me lie in bed and not sleep in the rain." The other passengers chimed in to express their similar experiences. Of course, everyone had different details. For example, some passengers praised the breakfast dessert in the cheap hotel. The sailors were regretful that they didn't manage to drink the cheap and good lanty proof. They started teasing the passengers. "Perhaps the one who spent the night with you wasn't the chicks here but the burly man like Theodore. Since all of you were drunk, there's no way to know what happened. Try touching your assholes." Amidst the lively atmosphere, the sailors withdrew the gangway and raised the sails, allowing the liner to set off slowly. Alfred finally relaxed after they passed through a dark sea and returned to the familiar safe sea route. He smiled at his adjutant and squire and said, "You can mark this place on our map," mentioning that the liquor and desserts here aren't too bad. Yes, the girls have their own traits. After a few more days of traveling, the passenger finally arrived at Desi Bay's Eskilson harbor, after traveling along a winding safe sea route. Alfred, who had the demeanor of a noble, and his socialite instincts, paid a visit to the brass of a nearby military base and shared a good dinner with them. When he returned to one of his father's vacation villas, he was surprised to find the squire whom he had sent away to gather for information. "What's wrong?" Alfred put away his disorganized thoughts. The squire lowered his voice and said, "General, all the official maps in the kingdom have no indication of Utopia Harbor." Chapter 13:30 Moving in. Alfred felt the room temperature plummet when he heard his squire. An indescribable chill invaded his body, freezing his blood and bone marrow. When the liner stopped at Utopia port, he had expected the worst situation to happen. Utopia was the headquarters of some cult, and that everyone there was a dangerous lunatic. But now, the truth was even worse. Perhaps Utopia never existed. At that moment, Alfred was unusually thankful that he was no longer the noble scion he was when he left Backlund. He had accumulated a great deal of experience and had thus, not really entered Utopia Harbor. Under the gaze of the adjutant and squire, the major general paced back and forth with a solemn expression. He calmly instructed, "Draft up a telegram and report to MI9 about what happened in Utopia. At the same time, request the local official beyonders to immediately take action and contact the captain to list down all the people who entered Utopia Harbor. If necessary, pay each of them a visit and confirm if there are any problems." "Yes, sir." His adjutant immediately stood at attention and saluted. After the adjutant walked out of the study, Alfred said to a squire, "Bring up the typewriter from downstairs. I want to write a detailed report." His plan was to first use a telegram to report the key information to the brass and not delay the initial actions necessary. Then, he would reveal more details with a confidential document and provide more information for the military brass to make a decision. Wendell walked into a second-class carriage with one hand on his top hat and the other carrying a suitcase. He wasn't even 30 years old. His sideburns were deep black and his brown eyes were calm. He didn't have any unique features that anyone could remember, but he exuded comfortable vibes. A few months ago, he was still a Phanepotter intelligence officer who was active in Desi Bay, and had contributed greatly. Now that he was a Sequence 7 Beyonder, he was part of MI9's Internal Affairs Department. Today, his goal was to send a confidential document to Backlund and personally hand it into the hands of MI9's director. After sitting down, Wendell bought a newspaper from the paperboy and leisurely read through it. This was just a superficial act. In reality, he began to use his Beyonder powers to illustrate portraits of the passengers around him, remembering all their characteristics, making meticulous and perfect preparations for any accidents that might happen later. Chew. The steam locomotive was chugging forward as the scenery outside sped past the windows. A few hours later, Wendell cast his gaze out of the window with some anxiety. The sky was already filled with dark clouds, and a storm was about to descend. This meant that the steam locomotive would stop at a station ahead of time to tide through the storm. It might only continue its journey the next morning, and not reach its designated location. In Wendell's opinion, this would undoubtedly lead to more risks due to a deviation in his expectations. However, it was beyond him. He couldn't change the weather like the sea god, who was promoted by the Rørsted Archipelago's new government. The only thing he could do was pray to the Lord of Storms. Reality proved that praying was useless most of the time. By the time the sky turned dark, the station in front of them had already sent a light signal to get the train to slow down and stop. Chew. The steam engine whistled again, and the train slowed down. Finally, it stopped at an unfamiliar platform. In the next second, near the steam-powered train's head, the mechanical door opened. The train conductor stood at the entrance and shouted to the staff on the platform, "What happened up ahead?" "Heavy rain." Visibility is 0, the white sideburned employee answered loudly. Just as he finished speaking, a muffled thunder sounded, causing everyone to tremble as they sensed the incoming storm. Damn it, the train conductor cursed. Which station is this? As it wasn't a normal stop, he didn't really know which station he was at. After all, the schedule he was in charge of didn't stop at every station in the past. Utopia. It's a small station. You can arrange the rest yourself, the staff shouted and ran towards the other end of the platform with the glass lantern in hand. I have to give the train behind a signal. The train conductor had no doubts about the staff's attitude because this was a normal dispatch process. Otherwise, an accident between two steam locomotives would happen. He could even be certain that the other staff members of the Utopia station had already sent a telegram to the other stations to warn them. Of course, they must have received a telegram to learn of the area ahead being enveloped by a heavy storm. Utopia, Wendell repeated the name in a low voice, not finding any useful information in his mind. Of course, he didn't think too much of it. This was because there were many unknown steam locomotive stations in the entire Lone Kingdom. This was a manifestation of the country's overall strength. The train conductor looked at the dark sky and muttered a few words before using the newest megaphone to speak to the passengers on board. A storm is coming. The train will stop at Utopia Station until 8 in the morning tomorrow. He estimated the storm to continue the entire night. You can stay in the carriage, or you can exit on your own accord to head into the city to look for an inn. Tomorrow, simply show your ticket stub to board the carriage again. Remember to be on time. The train conductor gave the passengers two choices. Wendell looked at the passengers inside the second-class carriage and pondered for a few seconds before carrying his suitcase and walking out of the train. It wasn't that he couldn't handle the harsh environment that wasn't conducive for good sleep. When he was an intelligence officer, he had been through plenty of hardship. He was only relying on his professionalism that the sealed carriages, which were limited in space for passenger movement, weren't as safe as a single room in an inn. Of course, he could also stay up all night, but this would definitely affect his condition tomorrow. Clearly, he still had a long journey tomorrow. After exiting Utopia Station, Wendell got on a rental carriage by the side of the road and said to the carriage driver, "To the municipal square." In the Lone Kingdom, there would definitely be a cathedral and a hotel near the municipal square. "Sir, are you planning on going to the hotel?" the carriage driver asked as he made the horse turn around, seemingly capable of getting along well with anyone. Yes. As a Sequence 7 Beyonder, Wendell didn't hide it. In his opinion, as long as he lived in the city center while overseas, he could easily find a group of helpers with his status, and his strength was enough to support him in completing this task. The best hotel in Utopia is Red Boots. "Are we going there?" the coach driver asked in a suggestive tone that all men knew. If he didn't have a mission, Wendell wouldn't mind pleasuring himself. However, he could only shake his head without any hesitation. "I want a quiet hotel." "All right," the coachman replied disappointedly. "Let's go to the Irises Hotel. No one will disturb you there." As the carriage advanced, Wendell cast his gaze outside the window to observe the situation outside. Perhaps it was because the storm was about to arrive, the people on the road were all in a rush. Even the paperboys looked down. A very small city. Wendell came to a preliminary conclusion from the lack of a track carriage. He only saw one trackless carriage. This meant that most of the areas in Utopia could be reached on foot in an adequate amount of time. Just as he had expected, in less than 10 minutes, the rental carriage stopped at the entrance of the Irises Hotel. Wendell paid the fare and rushed into the hotel before the rain fell. He heard pattering sounds behind him just as he entered. After checking in and putting down his luggage, Wendell rested for a while. He kept the confidential document close to him and went to the restaurant on the first floor to enjoy dinner. He cautiously didn't have any alcoholic beverages and asked for a cup of fizzling iced tea, which was supposedly a local specialty, and a fried pork chop drenched in apple juice. As a former intelligence officer of high society, Wendell didn't have much expectations for dinner this time, but he was surprised by the meal. The pork chop was fried in a succulent and juicy manner that gave off a strong fragrance. The apple juice that was poured on it had a slightly acerbic texture that washed away most of the cloyed taste. The fizzling iced tea was refreshing and especially delicious. When he foot the bowl, Wendell nodded at the medium-billed waiter and said, "Please send my compliments to the chef for giving me the pleasure of this wonderful dinner." The ordinary-looking waiter smiled and replied, "That wouldn't be an issue. In all of Utopia City, our chefs are the best." Wendell didn't chit-chat and quickly returned to his room to make some arrangements to prevent others from sneaking in. Then, he fell asleep without any hesitation. He used a relatively safe period of time, which any possible enemies would find unsuitable for taking action, to sleep and pass the time late into the night. After an unknown period of time, Wendell was suddenly woken up by an intense argument. He snapped open his pocket watch to take a look and realized that it wasn't even midnight. "It's from next door." A woman's voice. A man's voice. Wendell sat up and listened carefully. Initially, he suspected that it was a man and woman flirting, but later, he realized that it was too intense. Some of the items were even thrown onto the wall. A quarrel turning into a fight? Just as Wendell mumbled, he heard the shouting, cursing, and screaming of a woman. Beating a woman? As a lone gentleman, although Wendell believed in the Lord of Storms and discriminated against women, it didn't stop him from thinking that men shouldn't be violent towards women. After 2 seconds of consideration, he decided to knock on the door and remind his neighbors to take note. At that moment, a tragic cry rang out. This was obviously from a man. Thud. Something heavy fell to the floor. Wendell's brows twitched as he sharply caught the scent of a criminal case. He stood up, put on his coat, and went to the room next door. He bent his fingers and knocked twice. A few seconds later, the door creaked open, and a beautiful woman with long, wavy hair appeared in front of Wendell. Her hair was in a mess, and her face was ghastly pale. Her light green clothes were stained with blood, and she was holding a dagger that was dripping with blood. The lady in her early 20s stammered for a while before speaking in a dreamy tone, "I killed someone." Chapter 1331 Pleasure in helping others. Wendell wasn't unfamiliar with murder at all. When he heard that, he wasn't afraid at all. Instead, he calmly allowed his gaze to wander past the woman at the door and into the room's interior. He immediately saw a man lying on the ground. His chest was blood red. "Are you sure he's dead?" Wendell asked calmly. The young lady in her 20s was at a loss at first. Then, she answered with uncertainty, "Maybe. I don't know. If there's still hope, we need to send him to the hospital immediately." Wendell's tone was like he was speaking to a patient's family, not a murderer. The lady holding the blood dagger subconsciously turned her body and made way. Wendell took a few steps forward and approached the victim. He didn't need to squat down. He swept his gaze and made a judgment based on various signs. He is indeed dead. The woman in her 20s with messy, flaxen-colored hair didn't show any obvious change in expression. She looked down at her toes and said, "Call the police." "How do I address you?" Wendell had already heard hurried footsteps coming from the stairs. It was obvious that the attendant or hotel owner came up to check on the commotion after hearing the screams. "Tracy," the pure lady with an attitude answered softly. She then sank into her own world and didn't say another word. Wendell was just about to say something when the owner of the hotel who had helped him check in previously had already rushed through the door. "Goddess," the elderly man shouted after seeing the situation in the room. Wendell pressed down with his right hand, gesturing for him to calm down before saying, "Call the police immediately. I'll stay here and watch." His temperament and words exuded a sense of confidence that convinced others. The owner of the hotel didn't waste any time and immediately turned around and ran downstairs. As for Wendell, when he first came over to check on the situation, it was just a habit as a gentleman. In fact, he didn't have the intention to get involved in it. After all, he was still shouldering the mission. However, Miss Tracy's dazed, detached, and cold attitude induced a sense of pity in him. This was a normal reaction for a man. He surveyed the area as though he was conversing with the air. Killing someone doesn't imply a harsh punishment. It can be categorized into many kinds of situations. Tracy slowly raised her head and cast her gaze at the gentleman. There was an indescribable luster in her lifeless eyes. Wendell glanced at her bruised face. "He hit you?" "Yes." The man seemed to have some sort of authority, making Tracy, who wanted to remain silent, finally answer. Wendell looked down at the dagger that was no longer dripping blood. "Was it you who brought it here, or him?" Tracy's response was a little slow as she replied, "Him." Wendell nodded slightly and said, "Exercising your right to self-defense is in line with the law. I can testify to the police that you had an intense argument before it happened and that there was a fight. Clearly, men naturally possess an advantage in this aspect. I'm not discriminating against women, but it's something explained by science and experience." He paused and asked, "What is the relationship between the two of you? What happened?" Tracy's eyes darted about and she recovered a little from that deep, reclusive state. She seemed to be answering a policeman's question as she said with a look of hope and sorrow, I am his mistress." Upon saying this, a self-deprecating smile appeared on Tracy's face. "I used to be an ugly woman who blindly chased after money. Not long after I left the grammar school, I became his mistress under his enticement. He gave me a hotel and let me stay there. I wait for his arrival or for him to summon me every week. I lost interest in this lifestyle, feeling increasingly suppressed as my inferiority complex grew. I wanted to return everything to him and get rid of him completely, but he wasn't agreeable. He threatened me using all sorts of methods and refused to let me leave him. The recent times we met all ended in fights. Just now, he said that there was only one way to leave him, and that was death. Then, he beat me up and took out a dagger. Why, you know what happened after that, mistress." Wendell cast a regretful and pitiful glance at Tracy's face and said, "The traces at the scene have also confirmed the development of the situation." He had originally thought that Tracy and the deceased were husband and wife, but to his surprise, their relationship was worse than he had imagined. Tracy nodded blankly and said, "Thank you." She didn't say another word. She only broke the silence when the police arrived. She raised her hands and accepted the handcuffs. Wendell looked at her staggered pace and said to the police, "Bring her to check on her injuries first and treat them to avoid any accidents." The police officers didn't know why they had to listen to instructions from a witness. In short, they led Tracy and Wendell to a small hospital in the city without any objections under the heavy rain. As Tracy was a woman, Wendell and 2 police officers waited in the corridor of the hospital without entering the room. As time passed, Wendell saw a pregnant woman being sent to the delivery room in a hurry. There seemed to be some problems and they needed help with the labor process. After a while, he heard the sound of a baby crying, an announcement of a new life coming to this world. At this moment, Tracy happened to come out. "Do you feel it?" "Life's beauty," Wendell said to Tracy solemnly. As Tracy listened to the baby's cries amidst the howling wind and rain, her expression was clearly touched. Her face had already been wiped clean, making her look very clean and simple. After a few seconds, Tracy returned to her senses and nodded at Wendell before saying, "Thank you." This time, she was no longer as numb, blank, and reclusive. Wendell secretly heaved a sigh of relief and followed her to the police station to record a statement. After doing what was necessary, Wendell walked to the street side and prepared to take a rental carriage back to the Irises Hotel. However, in the middle of the stormy night, there were no pedestrians or carriages on the road. This is the disadvantage of a small city. It's not convenient enough, Wendell muttered. He opened the umbrella he had brought with him and made his way back to the Irises Hotel. As a former sheriff, he had the memory, in the mystical sense, of the route he had taken before. He wasn't worried about getting lost in the small city. At this moment, the storm had already reduced significantly. However, the strong winds continued to sweep past Wendell, causing rain to fall on him. This caused Wendell to raise his right hand and block his chest. That confidential document was hidden on the inside of the clothing. Wendell had previously kept the document close to him even when he was sleeping, not allowing it to be separated from him. For this reason, he had already developed a habit. As long as he had the corresponding self-reminders, he wouldn't turn over once he fell asleep. After walking for about 15 minutes in the small town of Utopia, Wendell saw the Irises Hotel. At that moment, his top hat and clothes were drenched due to the strong winds. This made him a little worried that the confidential document would be damaged by the water. Strictly speaking, I have already violated the rules of the mission, but how could I not help a lady like her? This is what a gentleman should do. Wendell was slightly vexed, but he didn't regret it at all. After entering the room, he immediately removed his jacket and took out the document, placing it on the table. The envelope containing the document was already visibly soaked. There were quite a few places that seemed to tear with a little force. Wendell immediately rang the bell and called for an attendant to ask for a gas stove, hoping to raise the temperature in the room and accelerate the air-drying process of the sealed document. In the process of waiting, he realized that the silence expected from the middle of the night wasn't there. It was as if the screams and the police's arrival had caused the tenants and nearby residents to wake up without being able to fall asleep. The howling winds lessened significantly, and Wendell could hear children crying, married couples arguing, the sound of a wooden violin being played, intermittent sobbing, the footsteps on the stairs, and the occasional sounds of discussion that were sometimes suppressed and sometimes raised without realizing it. He didn't feel anything about this lively scene. He just felt that they were noisy that prevented him from calming down. After a while, the attendant brought over a coal stove. Wendell relaxed and asked casually, "Do you know that Miss Tracy?" The thin attendant shook his head. "No." He then added, "I heard that she's a local, but I've been living outside in the plantations outside the city before this year." "What do you know about her?" Wendell asked subconsciously. "She comes to our hotel 3 to 5 times a month, with the dead man." The waiter suddenly sighed. "She's not happy at all." Wendell was silent for a few seconds before dismissing the attendant and returning to his desk. Seconds ticked by as the envelope outside the confidential document gradually dried up. At this moment, the inside and outside of the hotel had become relatively quiet. Only the sound of rain falling and the sound of the windows being rattled by the winds could be heard. Wendell was full of spirit as he recalled everything that had happened. He sighed for Miss Tracy's life and flipped the envelope. At this moment, he realized that some damage had appeared on the bottom part of the envelope, revealing the piece of paper inside. Wendell frowned, knowing that he was about to be punished. Of course, the punishment wouldn't be too heavy, as if the document to be distributed was confidential enough, he wouldn't be the only one to dispatch it. Wendell had originally planned on maintaining the present state and showing the damaged situation during the handover. However, when he swept his gaze, he saw a word on the document through the hole, Utopia. Wendell's nerves tightened, and he felt as if the sound of the wind and rain outside had suddenly stopped. Chapter 1332 Shocked in the middle of the night. Why is the confidential document that I'm dispatching mentioning Utopia? What's so special about this place? Many thoughts flashed through Wendell's mind as he heard a buzzing sound. At this moment, He felt as though he was going to fall sick from overexertion. Wendell quickly forced himself to calm down. He carefully recalled all the experiences he had encountered after coming to Utopia, and he discovered that there were no problems with every detail. They were all things that he might encounter in daily life. The only thing that made him uneasy was that his arrival was too coincidental. It was common for the steam locomotive to stop at the last minute due to a storm, but to stop somewhere related to the confidential document in his hand couldn't be explained away with coincidence. Wendell stared at the confidential document on the table with a solemn expression. He hesitated as to whether he should open them and read them carefully. Perhaps it's just a passing mention of Utopia. My actions will severely violate internal affairs. Perhaps this is the report of a certain intelligence agent secretly investigating Utopia. The contents will decide whether I survive to a certain extent, or die. After struggling for a while, Wendell looked out the window at the dark night sky and reached for the document. Only by being alive could one consider the punishment. Having made up his mind, Wendell swiftly removed the envelope outside and flipped through the typed files inside. As he read, his hand trembled slightly. He felt a chill run down his back. Even the burning furnace didn't help. No matter which angle he read it from, the confidential report in his hands indicated that there was something wrong with Utopia, the entire town. This might be a city that didn't exist in the real world. Wendell felt his mouth go dry, as though he had heard the footsteps of death slowly approaching him with a sickle. Instinctively, he wanted to get up, but in the end, he controlled himself and didn't react rashly. This was because he could feel pairs of eyes staring at him in the darkness outside, the room upstairs, and the corridor outside. What should I do? Up till now, nothing abnormal happened. This means that if I didn't know anything, it's possible that I'd be safe and welcome daybreak. I've read through a lot of information, and if I rashly show that I already know about the strange environment around me, it would only cause danger to erupt ahead of time. However, I can't just not do anything and leave my fate to luck. Wendell recalled all the dangers he had experienced before and quickly made up his mind. He was prepared to immediately return to the steam locomotive, and stay far away from Utopia to a certain extent. At least, most of the people there were normal, while the city was full of danger. Of course, Wendell couldn't just run back like that. He had to act normal, as though he had left the hotel in the middle of the night to return to the steam locomotive station. Amidst his thoughts, Wendell put away his confidential report and stood up calmly. He put on his coat and put on his top hat. Then, with his luggage in one hand and an umbrella in the other, he calmly walked to the door and turned the doorknob. At this moment, the corridor was dark, with only a few gas lamps on both sides of the corridor giving off light that wasn't bright enough. It added signs of human life to the silent environment in which he could hear a pin drop. When Wendell entered the corridor, the wooden floor beneath his feet made a slight creaking sound. It was so clear in the silent night that it traveled far into the distance. With a slight frown, Wendell intentionally took a normal step forward and approached the staircase in the middle of the corridor. He walked without any worries and had no intention of acting furtively. As he saw the stairs getting closer, he suddenly heard a squeaking sound behind him. "Sir, where are you going?" A slightly hoarse and intermittent male voice sounded in Wendell's ears. Wendell's body stiffened. He slowly turned back and saw the wooden door to the service room open. An attendant came out and stood in the shadows of the door. He quickly smiled and said calmly, "I have an important item on the steam locomotive. I'm afraid that someone would take it away, so I have no choice but to return now." At this point, he softly grumbled, "A murder happened at the hotel. I don't want to stay here anymore. I can't sleep at all. I'm very sorry." The attendant bowed slightly and responded, "I won't spread the news." Wendell nodded with a promise and then walked back up the stairs. Perhaps it was due to the dim lighting in the night, he walked very carefully. Every step was like walking on the edge of a precipice. 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps. Wendell, who had been on guard towards the attendant behind him, finally returned to the first floor. At that moment, not a single person was present in the hotel lobby. All the items were hidden in the darkness, and the faint light from the outside cast a blurry silhouette, just like monsters eager to devour people. Wendell looked ahead and walked through the dark lobby before reaching the door. Just as he pushed open the door and went out, he suddenly heard some rustling sounds behind him. It was as if there were rats moving around, or it was as if someone was approaching him with light footsteps. The back of Wendell's head went numb, but he held back his impulse to make a dash for it. He raised his head normally and looked up at the sky, which had already stopped raining. Then, he inhaled the cold, fresh air and made his way to the steam locomotive station. He quickened his pace, looking like he was afraid of the night and eager to end this journey. As he walked, Wendell saw a signboard from the corner of his eye. Utopia Telegraph Office. The telegraph office. Perhaps I can try sneaking in and send an emergency telegram to the Backlund headquarters and Eskelson military base. That way, I can look forward to the rescue from demigods. If I'm really trapped here and unable to leave, this will be the only way to save myself. Wendell thought for a moment before taking a few steps diagonally, arriving at the entrance of the Utopia Telegraph Office. He wasn't in a hurry to find a place to sneak in. Instead, he focused his attention and listened to the movements inside. Following that, he heard intermittent sounds of heavy breathing. This made Wendell occasionally feel that there was no one inside, and at times, he felt that there was more than one person inside. Suddenly, the sound of breathing stopped. All of Wendell's hair stood on end. His intuition told him that a figure was standing quietly behind the door of the telegraph office. Without any hesitation, Wendell immediately gave up the thought of sending a telegram. He walked past the door and continued proceeding forward. For the rest of the journey, even a gust of wind left Wendell trembling in fear. He was afraid of encountering an unknown danger. Time passed slowly as Wendell experienced the torment. Finally, he reached the entrance of the steam locomotive station and saw that the door was tightly shut. He couldn't enter. This wasn't a problem for Wendell. He first passed the umbrella to his left hand that was carrying his luggage, then went to the side and found a wall. With a press of his palm, he rose into the air and easily flipped over. After landing his feet firmly on the ground, Wendell heaved a sigh of relief and began walking towards the platform at an unhurried pace. At that moment, an inaudible sound of footsteps could be heard behind him. "What are you doing here?" A deep and hoarse voice rang out. Wendell's toes tightened as cold sweat broke out on his back. He didn't hesitate. As he prepared to get violent, he made his body turn slowly and stiffly. The first thing that entered his eyes was a classic glass lantern, followed by the staff member from before. Wendell exhaled and grumbled, "It's not appropriate for you to appear in such an environment on such a night. As a gentleman, you have to avoid scaring others." "I'm not a gentleman," the staff member replied in an unfriendly manner. Wendell pointed to the corner of the platform. "I'm going to the bathroom." He had already observed the platform's environment and layout of the platform earlier in the day. "Then, why are you here?" the worker asked. "I'm lost," Wendell answered simply. Following that, he ignored the staff and walked towards the bathroom. Behind him, the staff member watched silently without saying a word. This gave Wendell a lot of mental stress, but he maintained his gait very well. In the bathroom, under the illumination of the wall lamps, Wendell took nearly a minute to relieve the tension in his body and successfully peed. After returning to the steam locomotive, Wendell finally found a sense of security as he looked at the passengers lying on their beds. In the next few hours, he didn't sleep at all and was on guard against any accidents. Just as Wendell's grasp of the passage of time slowed down, the sky gradually brightened and dispersed the darkness. In the next 2 hours, the travelers who had gone to Utopia returned one after another. Some bought a bottle of local red wine. Some looked haggard. They looked like they had been beaten up or were hungover. Wendell was very wary of them, but he couldn't discover anything unusual in the details. Chew. Finally, the whistle sounded as the steam locomotive slowly began to move. Amidst the chugging sounds, the train left Utopia Station. After that, they went through another dark, gloomy weather. Fortunately, no thunderstorm descended, and the sun quickly pierced through the clouds and illuminated the ground. For Wendell, all of this was normal. It had been like this since he arrived at Utopia last night. If not for the confidential report which was hidden near his chest, he definitely wouldn't have believed that there was any problem with Utopia. When the steam locomotive reached the next stop, one that everyone was familiar with, Wendell finally relaxed. He felt as if his brain ached with a throb, as though he had been drained of his energy. At this moment, he quickly recalled his experience in Utopia. As he recalled, Wendell suddenly sat up straight. He had used the excuse of going to the bathroom last night, but he was carrying his luggage and an umbrella. He didn't look like a passenger who had just come down from a steam train. The station worker didn't realize this, or rather, he had already discovered it, but he did not expose him for some unknown reason. Chapter 1333 Warning. Using his experience as example, all of a sudden, the muscles on Wendell's back began to tense up as if he were about to explode. He was shocked and doubtful as several guesses flashed through his mind. The residents of Utopia are monsters in human skin. They usually look normal, but once they encounter blind spots in logic, they would show a side that is different from an ordinary person, ignoring the points that are obviously problematic. Or perhaps that staff realized that I was lying and was unwilling to deal with me, so he pretended not to see me and let me go? But why? Yes, carrying my luggage to the bathroom can be explained away as me being afraid of losing my luggage, but the entire platform is sheltered. There's no need to take the umbrella. Besides, the rain had already stopped. Wendell instinctively turned his gaze out of the window, only to see the sunlight shining on the platform he was at. One by one, passengers waited in order behind the safety line, completely different from the dark and gloomy vibes that Utopia gave off. Phew. He exhaled and suddenly relaxed. This isn't Utopia. I've already left. Wendell murmured to himself as he wiped away the cold sweat that had seeped out from his forehead. When he recalled his oversight earlier, it was as if he had fallen into a nightmare that he couldn't wake up from no matter how hard he tried. After a while, Wendell stood up and decided to smoke at the platform to ease his mood. The tobacco comforted him greatly, allowing him to recall his past experiences in Utopia. During this process, he gained inspiration from his encounter. Maybe it's because I sincerely helped Tracy, so that staff member intentionally ignored my problematic actions and let me go? Compared to the entire population of Utopia being monsters hiding underneath human skin, Wendell was more willing to accept this explanation. At this moment, from the corner of his eye, he saw the conductor talking to a group of people in a corner. Wendell took a few steps forward, trying to hear what they were saying. With the help of his hearing that transcended the normal limits of hearing, he vaguely heard the conversation from a distance that wouldn't incur suspicion. Last night, the station. Utopia doesn't exist in the kingdom, please keep it a secret. Wendell's brows twitched slightly. Based on the description of the document near his chest, he roughly understood what the train conductor was talking about. They were saying that the kingdom didn't have a station known as Utopia at all, and last night, the steam locomotive had gone missing. At that moment, a strong sense of horror surged through Wendell's heart again. He felt that it was his greatest blessing to be able to leave Utopia alive. Alfred spent nearly a week before returning to Backland from Eskilson Harbor. This was because he had visited the family of his deceased comrades, his old friends, the elders who had returned to their fief for vacation, and some of his family's business partners along the way. This is even more tiring than participating in battle, Alfred grumbled to his father, Earl Hall. Earl Hall smiled and pointed at the staircase. "Return to your room and get some rest. We'll talk in the study later." He was quite satisfied with the mental state and progress of his second son. Alfred surveyed the area and asked with a smile, "Where's the most dazzling jewel of Backlund?" He paused for a moment before adding, "What about Hibbert?" Earl Hall laughed and said, "Audrey went to her foundation and will only return in the afternoon. She kept complaining that you couldn't provide her with a definite schedule, preventing her from knowing when you would arrive. Hibbert is now a cabinet secretary. He's very busy." Alfred nodded and returned to his room to take a shower. He changed into a shirt, vest, and formal suit. "I prefer East Balham's casualness." He looked into the mirror and smiled at his adjutant. "This outfit makes you look more like a noble," his adjutant said as he handed him the document in his hand. "General, this is from MI9. Me 9? Alfred thoughtfully destroyed the seal on the envelope. "There's a result regarding the investigation of Utopia that quickly?" Before he could finish his sentence, he pulled out the document and flipped through it. During this process, Alfredo flipped through the pages slower and slower. In the end, he read it again from the first page. The main content of this investigation was divided into two parts. The first was regarding the MI9 member who had dispatched Alfred's report. He had accidentally entered Utopia and witnessed a murder case. He managed to forcefully escape in the middle of the night and return to the steam locomotive. The second was that the railways in Desi Bay which led to Backlund didn't have a stop named Utopia Station along the way, nor was there a harbor known as Utopia in the Berserk Sea. The subsequent investigators didn't find any traces. The two cases didn't exceed the limits of Alfred's imagination. What surprised him was the criminal involved in the murder. Her name was Tracy. She was the owner of a hotel. She had received middle-class education and graduated from grammar school. After that, she became a mistress of a businessman. Recently, she was trying to free herself from this identity. This was identical to the owner of the Harbor Hotel, Tracy, that Alfred had met. Every detail matched. As a result, Alfred determined that the culprit behind the murder was Tracy, the beautiful woman who had received a certain degree of education, who was able to produce sad music in the middle of the night. Is this her backstory? Alfred muttered to himself silently. This made the residents of Utopia seem very realistic. It wasn't what Alfred had expected, an illusion. In other words, after the outsiders left, the inhabitants of Utopia continued to lead their own lives. They had their own love, hatred, pains, and sorrow. They had all sorts of experiences. Apart from Utopia seeming to not exist in the real world, it was similar to any ordinary town in the Lone Kingdom. Perhaps, Utopia is real. Everyone there is real. However, if one wants to enter the town, they have to be in the right place at the right time. Alfred nodded indiscernibly and put away the investigation report he had received from MI9. To him, even if this matter ended here, he had no intention to investigate further. One had to know that, in the southern continent, there were countless bizarre incidents and phenomena. If one was too curious, it would only bring him greater danger than he imagined. After adjusting his clothes and mood, Alfred came to his father's study and knocked on the door with his curled finger. "Come on in." Earl Hall's voice rang out. Alfred tidied his blonde hair, pushed the door open, and sat down. Earl Hall smiled at him and said, "You're already a man." "No one would say such words to a man," Alfred replied without any reservations. "In my heart, you're still that rebellious youth," Earl Hall said with a smile. "You're already a Sequence 5 Beyonder?" Alfred replied with a double entendre, "Yes, I am a real knight." Earl Hall nodded and suddenly sighed. "You should have experienced a lot of hardship. From what I know, no matter if it's the potions or war, they will bring serious damage to people, from their bodies to their minds. Everyone undergoes a lot of pain in their lives, Alfred said with a sigh. He used a loan-styled euphemism. After a pause, he added, compared to when I left Backlund, my present state is even better. As long as I grasp a method properly, I don't need to worry too much about the impact of the madness at my level. Earl Hall didn't continue on this matter and instead said, your sister has also become a Beyonder. Oh. Alfred was shocked at first, but then he remembered something. He said with some annoyance, I thought she just changed her hobby. From the looks of it, Audrey's adventure had a little bit of your help, Earl Hall said, seemingly enlightened. I hope you can talk to her about how dangerous, crazy, and painful it is about the sequence potions. Let her remain at her current level. Alfred replied without hesitation, I'll do it. In the evening, in Audrey's small study room. Alfred, why are you looking for me? Audrey, who had changed into home clothes, led Susie and opened the door for her brother. She had been waiting for her brother for a few minutes. I have something to warn you of. Alfred walked into the study and casually pulled a chair over. Audrey smiled and pointed at the golden retriever. Do you need Susie to leave? Alfred couldn't help but smile as he looked at the obedient golden retriever who was sitting by the side, her eyes filled with a look of sentience. There's no need for that. I believe it won't eavesdrop on our conversation. Audrey casually corrected him. After the noble girl sat opposite him, Alfred sighed inwardly. After not seeing her for a few years, her younger sister was no longer as tender as before. Regardless of her looks or temperament, she had already reached a level that brought about amazement. She was no longer the little girl from the past. Alfred retracted his gaze and asked casually, I heard that you became a Beyonder? Yes. Audrey nodded frankly. Alfred had originally planned on asking what sequence she was, but after some thought, he felt that it was too direct. It was easy for her to flare up, so he deliberated over his words and said, you should be a Beyonder of the spectator pathway, right? The rainbow salamander has similar powers. The rainbow salamander was a gift from Alfred to his sister. After Audrey gave an affirmative answer, Alfred joked, can you do treatment in the mind domain now? Most Beyonders, including me, need help in this aspect. Yes, I forgot to tell you that I'm already a Sequence 5 disciplinary paladin of the Arbiter pathway. Audrey pursed her lips and smiled. I'm a qualified psychiatrist who has undergone professional training. You can verify this with father and mother. She's already a Sequence 7. Alfred's expression gradually turned solemn. Audrey, I have to remind you that the potions do not only bring about strength. Having said that, he paused and observed his sister's reaction. He realized that Audrey wasn't impatient at all and was listening very seriously. Every potion contains madness that can lead to a loss of control. I've seen similar situations before. More than once. They happen to my enemies, and they happen to my friends. No one is spared. Alfred amalgamated his experiences in East Balam and began explaining the dangers of the potion in detail. During this process, he realized that his sister, Audrey, wasn't the only one listening attentively. Furthermore, Susie, the golden retriever, appeared extremely quiet. Chapter 1334 Night with the Moon MI9's office building was located on Bellotto Street in Westboro, and it was an inconspicuous three-story building. The entrance didn't show any signs of its identity. It simply hung a door sign, 9. The core of this office building was underground, and above it was for the clerks. Of course, most of the Beyonders who were under MI9 wouldn't go underground for no reason. The environment there wasn't good, and the atmosphere was oppressive. It was possible that an accident could happen due to the failure to watch over a sealed artifact. Zio was now the deputy team leader of the National Security and Counter-Espionage Team. She was in charge of a rather small-scale Beyonder team, responsible for handling espionage cases regarding Intis in the greater area of Backlund. "There's a mission here." Her superior, MI9's deputy director, the team leader of the National Security and Counter-Espionage Team, Lieutenant General Pantek, picked up a document and handed it across the desk opposite him. "Is it very urgent?" Xiao received it and asked cautiously. Lieutenant General Pantek was a typical lone old man with a case of severe hairline recession. He picked up a white porcelain coffee cup and took a sip. "Not at all. It's quite low risk. In fact, this mission will be sent to all members, hoping that someone will be able to complete it by luck." This description was out of Xiao's expectations, but she didn't open the dossier on the spot and directly replied, "I will inform my team members." Xiao returned to her own room after leaving Lieutenant General Pantek's office. When she threw herself into her seat, she seemed to have hidden herself. Xiao quickly browsed through the documents in her hand and roughly understood why the deputy director said that. The utopia that needed investigation didn't seem to be anywhere in the northern and southern continent, nor were there on any of the known islands in the 5 seas. In the past 2 weeks, many people had entered the so-called utopia, but the way they entered was completely different. Some entered from the Berserk Sea's Sonia Sea waters, arriving by a terrifying storm. Some were midway on a railway that led from Desi Bay to Backlund. Due to a heavy storm, they had been delayed and stopped at the city. Others were in Civilaus County, and they entered because they were lost. Up to now, no one has been affected by the damage or mentally influenced. It's no wonder Deputy Director Pantek said that the danger level is very low. Also, there's no way to conclude the rules regarding the case, making it difficult for one to find the true location of Utopia. Therefore, there's no way for them to send people in to investigate. Yes. I can only tell all members of the situation, and hope that one of them will chance upon Utopia and carefully gather information in secret when they are there. Xiao put down the documents in her hand and stood up regretfully, preparing to inform the Beyonders under her. She was regretful that the mission was so difficult that she almost couldn't see hope. This made her unable to accumulate more merit points. In the past half-year, Xiao had been very busy every day in order to deal with the pending apocalypse. As she dealt with MI9's matters, she completed all the missions Mr. Fool had given her, so as to accumulate contributions on both sides in exchange for the formula and Beyonder characteristics of the imperative mage formula and Beyonder characteristic, to fulfill the wish of becoming a demigod. And up till now, Xiao was still lacking a little on both fronts, especially in MI9. If she didn't make any significant contribution, Xiao couldn't see any hope. If not for the generous salary from MI9 and all kinds of benefits that came with it, and how she could rely on her status and identity to monopolize a large amount of information so as to help her complete the missions given by Mr. Fool, Xiao yearned to resign and become a bounty hunter again. That way, she would have more freedom. I can ask about this case at the next tarot gathering. Perhaps Mr. World will have some clues. As Xiao thought, she pushed open the door to the room where her team members were. After assigning the Utopia mission, Xiao specially instructed, if the situation isn't right, even if you have the chance to enter Utopia, you can give up immediately. The town of unknown authenticity hasn't shown any danger. Perhaps it's because it hadn't been triggered. After busying herself for a while more, Xiao finally ended her day in exhaustion. She returned home before 7:30, and she had dinner with her mother, her brother, and Furs. She enjoyed a limited amount of relaxation. At midnight, she washed up and walked to the bedroom window. She grabbed the curtain and prepared to draw it. During this process, Xiao naturally cast her gaze outside and discovered that the crimson moon in the sky had already turned bigger at some point in time. Furthermore, the color had clearly deepened as though it was flowing blood. Blood moon. Xiao suddenly turned her head and looked next door in concern. She was a little worried about her good friend's condition. However, she quickly recalled that Furs was a sequence 4 demigod and no longer feared the effects of the full moon ravings. In the room next door, Furs was lying in bed, taking in the blood moon outside. As she endured the pain of her head being pricked by needles, she heard Mr. Dorr say, "Although going from sequence 3 to sequence 2 is indeed a qualitative change, going from an incomplete mythical creature to a real mythical creature, I believe that sequence 4 to sequence 3 has a qualitative change as well. It can even be said that sequence 3 is the best level in a Beyonder pathway. At this level, there is no need to rely on external forces to resist the madness and the inclination towards losing control. There is no need to endure the torment every second and minute. They will also possess Beyonder powers that completely exceed that of an ordinary person. They will be more godlike than they are human. Furthermore, they can obtain a small number of anchors and stabilize their mental state. If not for the fact that most sequence 3 Beyonders don't have long enough lives, with it being difficult for them to live to more than 500 years old. I believe there won't be many saints who have the motivation to advance to an angel. Yeah. Furs nodded, indicating that she had already understood. At the same time, her forehead twitched slightly and she yawned secretly. She was already a little accustomed to the pain from her direct conversation with Mr. Dorr. Mr. Dorr continued, "The apprentice pathway's sequence 3 is Wanderer. This means that the spirit world can no longer trap you. You can enter the cosmos, travel the astral world, head to different planets, and see true dead silence, true barrenness, true magnificence, and completely different civilizations. Only after experiencing it for yourself will you understand how insignificant the world you live in is." Mr. Dorr briefly explained his experiences as a showcase of the magnificence and beauty of the cosmos, displaying the stateliness and charm of different civilizations. This made Furs fall into a trance. If not for the sharp throbbing pain in her head still reminding her, she would have even forgotten that the speaker was a dangerous king of angels. "As long as you help me escape, I'll give you the potion formula and Beyonder characteristic of a wanderer and help you complete the ritual. Of course, this can be paid in advance." At the end of the full moon ravings, Mr. Dorr gave another promise. "It really makes me look forward to it," Furs marveled sincerely. When Mr. Dorr's voice gradually weakened and disappeared, Furs suddenly pulled out the pillow at her waist and lay down. In less than 3 minutes, she fell asleep in peace. To her, the vast cosmos was indeed filled with charm. However, it also contained the danger of being corrupted just from knowing about it. She had no motivation to explore it. "I'll consider it after touring all the places in the northern and southern continent and the 5 seas," in her sleep, Furs muttered almost silently to herself. At that moment, the blood-red moon outside the window had already faded. It returned to a light crimson color and wasn't full. A huge blood-colored moon hung on the edge of the cliff, illuminating the swamp below. The swamp was dark red and constantly bubbling, as though lava was boiling at the bottom of it. At a glance, there was no end to the swamp, like a vast ocean. "Pa!" A stone fell from the edge of the cliff and into the swamp. In the next second, a bubble appeared and silently burst, producing a blood-stained infant. The baby staggered, swam towards the cliff, and attempted to climb up. "Pa!" The stone beneath Emlyn White's feet shattered as he fell off the cliff and into the swamp. This sanguine earl suddenly jolted awake from his dream. He looked around in horror and confusion. After confirming that this was his room, where there were many extremely familiar dolls of different sizes, Emlyn slowly exhaled and said to himself with a rather solemn expression, that dream wasn't simple. As a shaman king, he had a good understanding of a dreamscape. Could this be the so-called divine revelation? But I didn't receive any revelations. Emlyn thought for a few seconds but couldn't come up with an answer. Then, he decided to ignore the problem and prepare to ask Father Yatravsky when he had the time. The incomplete moon that had its blood-red colors faded illuminated the garden of the Cathedral of Waves. Alger reached out his hand to grab the note delivered by the gale and read it. Verdu is looking for a pirate ship or a smuggling ship to Bansi. Bansi harbor had yet been rebuilt, and there were no liners from all over the world that headed there. Verdu, who treasured his limited teleportation opportunities, could only rely on extremely normal methods. Head to Bansi? Alger immediately frowned. He knew what Bansi meant, but he didn't understand why Verdu wanted to go to Bansi. There should be nothing there. No, even if the church has leveled Bansi, there's still something abnormal about it. Furthermore, the church didn't investigate what problems Bansi had hidden in the past. As a cardinal, Alger was qualified to read through some confidential documents, including the records of the actions that the Church of the Lord of Storms had done when dealing with Bansi. In addition, he had also learned more from Mr. Fool and the World Gehrman Sparrow. After some thought, Alger quickly came to a decision. He planned on getting his shadow guard to arrange a pirate ship for Verdu. In this aspect, Alger knew many key people to aid him. It didn't need him to show his face in person or use his name. Of course, smuggling ships in the Rörsted archipelago were often equivalent to pirate ships. You're tuning in to the Xiaofan's Wuxia Tales YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.